Chapter 111. On the Kunlun party's rocktop mountain, behind the majestic Grand Hall, there was a quiet hall built under pines and cypresses. Jean Dan Fryer and Melaleuca japonica often meditated here when they had nothing to do. Few people came here. Under the green pines and cypresses, the quiet hall was very quiet. The shadows of the trees were reflected on the ground, swaying slightly with the wind. Occasionally, the crisp chirping of birds could be heard from the distant forest, as if there was an otherworldly celestial atmosphere. In the quiet hall, other than the white-haired but youthful Melaleuca japonica, EXN was also kneeling at the side, carefully brewing tea, the fragrance filling the air. In a flash the tea was ready. EXN held the cup with both hands and placed it on the table in front of Melaleuca japonica, saying, "Uncle Master, please have some tea." The teacup was pure white, crystal clear like the first snow. The tea in the cup was clear and fragrant. One sniff was enough to know that it was a very precious tea in the world. Melaleuca japonica took a sip, then nodded slightly and smiled at EXN. "Little girl, your cultivation is not yet complete, but your tea brewing skills are amazing." EXN giggled. "My family grew up planting spiritual tea. After a few generations I dare not say anything else, but I do have the ability to brew tea." Melaleuca japonica nodded. "That's true. Back then your family's ancestor Yu was known as the Kunlun tea deity. He planted, tasted, and evaluated tea, all of which were peerless. That's why the E family passed down the family business. Even today the E family's unique tea, Little Crane, is still famous. No wonder you are so knowledgeable in the tea ceremony." EXN blinked and moved closer to Melaleuca japonica, whispering, "Uncle Master Yin, if you like Little Crane tea, I'll sneak some for you during next year's harvest, okay?" Melaleuca japonica laughed. "You're such a crafty girl. Why not this year?" EXN pursed her lips and said, "Martial uncle, you're blaming a good person wrongly. It's not like you don't know that it's not easy to grow this Little Crane tea. The annual yield is at most 1 to 2 caddies. Even so, our Kunlun sect has set an annual quota of 70 to 80% of it as a gift. There are also some elders in the sect who like to drink tea. Not to mention Jindan cultivators like you, there are even a few Yuanying Taoist masters. Our E clan does not dare to offend any of them." She spread her hands. "That's why when the new tea is produced this year, it'll be sold out in the blink of an eye. No matter how capable I am, I can't get more. Next year, when the tea leaves are harvested, I plan to sneak home and sneak into the tea fields to get some when it's dark." As she spoke, she looked at Melaleuca japonica with innocent and pitiful eyes. Melaleuca japonica chuckled and patted EXIN's head. All right, I'm just teasing you." As he spoke, he suddenly noticed from the corner of his eyes that there was still an inch-long scar on the left side of EXIN's pretty face. It was slightly red and seemed to be slightly abrupt. Her face darkened. Her fingers slid down and touched EXIN's cheek. EXIN seemed to feel something and shrank back. Melaleuca japonica snorted coldly. Such a beautiful face was almost ruined. Come to think of it, he got off lightly. If I had known, I would have killed him that day. EXN lowered her head slightly but quickly raised it again with a smile. "Forget it, it's all in the past. Don't be angry, martial aunt." Melaleuca japonica's eyes were filled with pity. "You're so young, yet you suffered so much for no reason. It must have been hard on you." As she spoke, her eyes suddenly turned cold. "Just as you said, your E family has been offering tea for so many years and you've built many friendships. Yet, when you were in trouble, not a single person stood up for you. How infuriating." EXN sighed and said, "I did ask my father about this, but he also told me that this matter can't be blamed on anyone else." "What did he say?" Melaleuca japonica was surprised. "My father said that although our E family's tea is good, it's just a dispensable beverage. If you like it, you can drink it. If you don't, it's fine." EXIN said. "But when it happened, he, senior brother, was a genius with a bright future. His master, Dukan Jinren, was a powerful Yuanying enlightened master and the first seat of the Heavenly Soldier Hall. He was highly respected in Kunlun, and even the enlightened master valued him. Under those circumstances, no one would go against them for some spiritual tea. My father said that it's hard to blame anyone. My father also said that our family's biggest sin is being too weak." Yenlua was silent. After a while, she let out a long sigh. Suddenly, she laughed self-mockingly and said, "So, I am the most foolish one?" EXN left her seat and knelt in front of Melaleuca japonica. She kowtowed and said in a low voice, "Uncle Master, you saved me from danger. EXIN cannot thank you enough. The entire E family is deeply indebted to you." In the future, if Uncle Master has any instructions, Exian will do her best, no matter. Yen Luo waved her hand to stop Exian from speaking. Then she pulled Exian up and said with a loving look in her eyes, "Just take care of yourself in the future. Furthermore, I'm not the only one who contributed to the outcome of that incident." Exian's expression changed slightly. She suddenly remembered what Lu Qin said to her. She was lost for a moment but recovered quickly. She smiled at Melaleuca japonica. "But you saved me. Don't worry, Uncle Master. No matter what happens next year, I'll definitely get you some little cranes." Melaleuca japonica laughed and pulled Exian to sit next to her. She sighed. "Speaking of which, it's all your cheap Master Dongfang's fault. He insisted on taking you as his disciple even before he recovered. In the end, he still can't come out from his closed-door training. He left you at Baichao Tang's place and let others bully you." Exian shook her head and smiled. "You can't say that. I'm indebted to my master. Without him, I wouldn't have been able to go to Kunlun." Pfft. Yen Luo spat in annoyance and said, "That unreliable old man has never done anything serious all day long. If it wasn't for him trying so hard to snatch you away, I would have been able to bring you up the mountain." Exian exclaimed. "Oh really?" Melaleuca japonica rolled her eyes at her. "Nonsense. Do you think I'm stupid? Why would I stand up for Dukan Jinren and his talented disciple for no reason? It's because I can't take it." "Oh, thank you so much." Exian held Melaleuca japonica's hand and said with a smile, "It's a pity that our Kunlun party doesn't allow us to worship more than one master. Otherwise, I'd worship you as my master too." "You wish?" Melaleuca japonica scolded with a smile. "But I've known that old man Dongfang Tao for many years. He's much stronger than me in terms of cultivation. If he didn't go into closed-door training to heal his injuries, I don't think those people would dare to bully you like this." Exn was taken aback. "Life and death are unpredictable? Isn't my master just recuperating in closed-door training?" Melaleuca japonica snorted, but there was a complicated look in the depths of her eyes. "If it was just to heal his injuries, he should have come out long ago. But it took so long. There must be a problem." Exn was more and more surprised. "What problem?" Melaleuca japonica extended 2 fingers. "There are 2 possibilities. First, old man Dongfang's injuries are deeper and more serious than we know. Even he can't take it. If he hasn't fully recovered after so long, he's probably not far from death. Second." She shook her head but lowered her voice and said to Exn, "I'm afraid he's found an opportunity. He's trying to break through to the Yuanying realm." Exn suddenly stood up and exclaimed, "Yuan?" Just as she said that, Melaleuca japonica had already covered her mouth with her palm and pulled her back. She glared at her and said, "Don't say anything." Exian's face was filled with disbelief. She was filled with excitement and nervousness. Even her body was trembling slightly. She nodded repeatedly. Melaleuca japonica then let go of her hand. Immediately after, Exian immediately covered her mouth with both hands, as if this was the only way to keep the secret. After a long while she seemed to have calmed down a little. However, she still didn't dare to move her hands away from her mouth. Through the gaps between her fingers she asked Melaleuca japonica in a trembling voice, "Senior Aunt, is this true?" Melaleuca japonica snorted. "I've already said that this is only my guess. However, I've known old man Dongfang for decades. I can tell what kind of person he is the moment he raises his butt. This time, it's most likely." Exn covered her mouth tightly and giggled foolishly. Even her eyes were squinting as she watched. Melaleuca japonica glanced at her and couldn't help but shake her head. She also laughed. "If that old thing is lucky and really breaks through that life and death barrier and advances to the Yuanying realm, then your good days will come. A Yuanying stage Taoist master who could summon the wind and rain, move mountains and fill the sea, had supernatural powers that could penetrate the heavens and the earth. Since ancient times, he had been an immortal class figure, standing at the top of the human cultivation world. However, such a person in such a realm, among the hundreds of millions of cultivators in the past thousands of years, only a very small number of people could reach this realm. This was because when one tried to break through to the Yuanying realm from the Jindan realm, there was an extremely dangerous life and death barrier that was extremely difficult to break through. When breaking through to the next realm, there would be the hindrance of the heart's devil from the outer realm. It was difficult to succeed unless one had great perseverance or strong luck. "That's great." Exin was excited for a while. She couldn't help but worry. She quickly put her palms together and closed her eyes to pray to the heavens. She said, "May the heavens bless Master, Bless that everything goes smoothly and that everything is stable and stable. Melaleuca japonica looked out of the quiet hall. Between the pine and cypress trees, the mountains in the distance could be faintly seen. The clouds were surrounded by celestial aura, but she didn't know who was hiding deep in the mountains. After a long time, Exian's voice suddenly came from beside her ear. She said, "Senior Aunt, I have a request." Chapter 112. What is it? Melaleuca japonica turned to Exian. Exian looked a little embarrassed but mustered her courage. "Martial Aunt, I heard that the candidates for the spirit cultivation team are about to be decided. How many people will be chosen this time?" Melaleuca japonica was taken aback. "Why are you asking?" Exian replied with an "oh," then stammered, "This? I have a friend who, also wants to be on this list." Melaleuca japonica smiled. "The spirit cultivation team accepts odd job disciples. Does your family have odd job disciples this year?" Exian quickly shook her head. No, it's just a friend I know. He's not from my family." She stole a glance at Melaleuca japonica. "I just wanted to ask if you could give him a chance." Melaleuca japonica looked at her with a faint smile. "Little girl, are you asking me to be biased?" Exian was startled and said, "Of course not, you've misunderstood. Isn't it stated in the rules that I, a direct disciple, also have the right to recommend candidates for the cultivation of spiritual power? That's why I'm recommending you." Melaleuca japonica thought for a moment. The candidates will be announced in 3 to 4 days. I remember it's already full." "Ah." Exian was shocked and disappointed. She mumbled, "Oh no. I'm too late. I came late." While speaking, her expression became a bit dejected, carrying a bit of pleading expression just looking at Yen Luo. Melaleuca japonica looked at her and suddenly laughed. "Little girl, why are you acting so pitiful? Fine, you're about to become a perfected master's disciple. You'll be honored. Tell me your friend's name and I'll see if I can put one in. But let me say this first, the cultivation of spiritual power has a requirement on the foundation of cultivation. If he can't pass the examination, then there's nothing we can do." Of course. Exian was overjoyed. She nodded and smiled. "Thank you for your kindness, Martial Aunt. My friend's name is Lu Chen." "Lu Chen?" Melaleuca japonica frowned. "Yes, that's right. Lu as in land, Chen as in dust, Lu Chen." Exian hurriedly repeated herself as if afraid that Yen Luo had misheard her. Melaleuca japonica nodded. "Okay, I'll remember it." Exian beamed with joy. She chatted with Melaleuca japonica for a while and then left. Yen Luo shook her head with a smile on her face as she watched the girl's back disappear from her line of sight. She sat there and thought for a moment. Then she suddenly stood up and went to a cabinet. She opened one of the drawers and found a book. At this moment, the smile on Yen Luo's face had disappeared. She picked up the scroll with an indifferent expression and flipped it open. Almost immediately, a piece of paper appeared on one of the pages. She opened the white paper and saw a few names written on it. Melaleuca japonica looked at the names one by one until her eyes stopped at the last name. Lu Chen was written on it. Melaleuca japonica stared at the 2 words and raised her eyebrows slightly. After a moment, she suddenly whispered to herself, "What is the background of this Lu Chen? Why are there so many people secretly helping him?" 3 days later, Lu Chen received a notice from Zhou Kuei, who was in charge of the odd job disciples. He was asked to go to the rock mountain to be inspected. At that time he was still working in the spirit field. When he heard the news he was a little surprised. But on the way to the hall on the mountain, he saw Exian waiting for him there with a smile on her face. He knew what was going on. On this day the weather was fine and sunny. Exian stood under a verdant pine and cypress, smiling like a flower. Her youthful beauty attracted the attention of many odd job disciples along the way. Lu Chen deliberately lagged behind. When most of the others had passed, he walked up and whispered, "Is this Miss Yi's method?" Exian snorted and revealed a proud expression. She boasted, "What do you think? I'm not bad, right?" Lu Chen gave her a thumbs up and said, "You did what you said. Amazing." Exian covered her mouth and laughed. She looked very happy. Then she looked at the main hall in front of her and said in a low voice, "Don't be too happy too early. I heard that there will be about 50 people selected for the spiritual power cultivation this time. But just now I saw that there were at least 60 people here. Don't be eliminated." Lu Chen smiled and said, "There shouldn't be a problem. Cultivating spiritual energy is all about using one's own spiritual energy to stimulate and cultivate some special spiritual plants. Among them, the most suitable are the wood and earth elements. Although my talent is poor, I have an earth element divine pillar on the 5 elements divine disc. EXN clapped her hands and said with a smile, "That's good. Anyway, you can pass the test. You go up. I will find a way to peep from the side later." Lu Chen laughed but did not say anything. He walked to the hall on the mountain. In the great hall of Rock Mountain, the 100 Herb Hall's odd job disciples were all gathered here. Lu Chen stood in the crowd and looked around. Sure enough, there was a huge crowd. There were indeed 60 to 70 people gathered here. Although there were many people here, the main hall was not noisy. The Kunlun sect was a place that attached great importance to rules. Even the handyman disciples had been taught many times after they entered the sect. No one dared to make noise here. After a while, the first group of people came out from the back of the hall. The leader was Jean Dan Friar Melaleuca Japonica. Behind her were 7 or 8 disciples. Some were in the foundation establishment realm, and some were in the chi refining realm. They all seemed to be talented personal disciples, and their status was much higher than that of the odd job disciples. Melaleuca Japonica did not reprimand them. When she came to the hall, she directly sat on the main seat. Naturally, someone stood up and spoke to everyone. She briefly explained that today's test was to see who was more suitable for the spirit cultivation. Martial Aunt Melaleuca Japonica would personally supervise them. Next, the personal disciples walked down and divided the odd job disciples into several groups. They began the test. As for the test method, it was similar to the celestial inspection mirror that most people used when they entered the sect. It seemed that EXIN was right. Bai Chao Tang was more concerned about the adaptability of the 5 elements. Lu Chen was assigned to one of the groups. Soon he realized that the examination wasn't slow at all. One by one, those whose name was called stepped forward and placed their hands on the immortal inspection mirror's surface. The light reflected from the mirror would reflect the person's innate talent. Not long after, someone called his name. When the 2 words Lu Chen were called, Melaleuca Japonica, who was sitting at the top, glanced at him without batting an eyelid. In a corner at the back of the hall, EXN secretly poked her head out and looked over worriedly. Lu Chen walked over. He looked very calm. After placing his hands on the mirror, he closed his eyes and calmed himself down. Then he began to circulate the spiritual energy in his body. Deep in the mountains, there was suddenly a muffled rumble of thunder. It sounded faintly from the clouds. Legend had it that some peerless geniuses would cause strange phenomena when they were appraising immortals. The heavens and the earth trembled. Rainbow light streaked across the sky. Dragons in the clouds and tigers in the fog. Auspicious beasts soared in the air. These were all magical phenomena that were rarely seen in the cultivation world. However, very few people had seen them before. This was because almost all of these phenomena belonged to the 5-pillar geniuses, who were 1 in 10,000. These lucky people seemed to be blessed by the heavens. Even when they were appraising immortals, their scenes were different. They were so high and mighty that people respected them. As for ordinary people, ordinary cultivators and disciples, they could at most possess a few rays of light that corresponded to the spiritual energy of the 5 elements. As for what was happening in this hall today, it was even more unlikely that there would be any accidents. This was because almost all the miscellaneous disciples were pillar disciples with the lowest talent. They only had 1 pitiful pillar in their spirit sea disk. They would only have 1 lonely ray of light that belonged to them. Most of them would only be able to communicate with 1 type of spiritual power in their entire lives. This would also directly limit the upper limit they could reach on the arduous and distant path of cultivation in the future. In the hall, the lonely and pure rays of light rose and fell. Everyone was silent, as if they were at the bottom of the world. They quietly accepted their fate and accepted this reality. Lu Chen placed his hand on the mirror. His expression was calm and natural. There was nothing out of the ordinary. There was no sign of nervousness either. He looked like an ordinary mortal who had already accepted his fate. The immortal inspection mirror began to tremble slightly. Zhou Kuei happened to be standing next to the immortal inspection mirror. His expression was solemn, but he was actually a little bored. In any case, it looked like a boring and monotonous object. Thus, he didn't have much of a reaction at first. He even forgot that when ordinary pillar disciples came to inspect it, the immortal inspection mirror would at most reflect light. There was no way it would tremble or anything like that. That moment was like a white steed flashing past a crevice. That moment was like a flash of lightning. That moment was like the blink of an eye. The immortal inspection mirror suddenly emitted a faint light. The faint light trembled like ripples on the surface of water. Several strange faint lights intertwined, forming an incomparably chaotic and strange graffiti-like image. Immediately after, in that indescribably minute instant, a smear of black suddenly spread out and erased all the light. The black was as deep as the sea. The black light was like an eternal and lonely night. However, a moment later, everything suddenly disappeared. As if a momentary blur, as if a passing cloud or a whirlwind, all the illusions were instantly annihilated without a sound. There was no faint light, no strange color, and no darkness. The immortal inspection mirror calmed down and returned to its normal state, as if nothing had happened. In that instant, everything was like a dream. No one had the time to remember or see that strange scene. The surface of the immortal inspection mirror slowly lit up with a yellow light. Lonely and bright. Zhou Kuei grunted in acknowledgement. He nodded and said, "The purity of the earth element spiritual energy is not bad." Chapter 113. The black dog ran happily in the mountains. There were almost no strong monsters in the mountains of Kunlun. Harmless birds and small animals could be seen everywhere in the mountains. The slightly larger and more powerful beasts were all hiding in the deep mountains and forests, not daring to come out easily. The only masters here were human beings. To be exact, they were the practitioners of the Kunlun party. Of course, Atsu didn't know the meaning of the phrase, a dog relying on its master's power, nor had it ever heard of such words. But these days, it really enjoyed playing in the mountains and forests near the Kunlun party's Shirpan mountain. Every time it went back home it would be dark, so much so that Lu Qin scolded it several times, saying that it had become wild. Every time Lu Qin scolded it, Atsu would listen respectfully and resolutely not change its mind. It seemed that it especially liked the mountains and forests from the bottom of its heart. It liked to jump and run in the mountains, rivers, forests, and grasses. Every time this happened, Atsu would feel that its blood was boiling, and even its lame leg was no longer an obstacle. Sometimes, it even couldn't help but stand on the mountain and howl loudly and mournfully at the endless mountains and the clear sky. It was like a wolf on a full moon night. Well, it was just a little bit like a wolf. Its howl was not powerful enough, and the most important thing was that Atsu had never come out at night. When it was dark, it would obediently go home and stay with Lu Qin in that simple and narrow room. One day Lu Qin went up the mountain and Atsu ran alone to play. It ran through the mountains, ran through the rivers, ran through the mountains, and then saw a somewhat strange mountain. The mountain was hidden in the mountains of Kunlun. It was neither tall nor big. Standing at the foot of the mountain, Atsu felt that the mountain was a little strange. It was twisted and steep and it seemed a little familiar. Atsu stared at it for a while. Suddenly an idea popped into his head and he found the answer. It felt that the shape of the mountain was like a dog's head. A mountain like a dog's head. Doghead Mountain. Atsu immediately became excited. It barked at the mountain and ran over happily. But at the foot of the mountain it suddenly stopped. It saw a naturally formed slope that occupied the entire side of the Doghead Mountain, and extended upwards. The slope, tiered by huge rocks and trees, was divided into a vast stairway, as if by some natural and conspicuous mark, which separated it from the rest of the world. A group of wild boars, a few goats, the occasional bird, and large herds of elk walked past it. Atsu, with some trepidation, kept a little distance from the tall animals, looked around and went up the hill again. When they reached the second step of the invisible and huge staircase, Atsu suddenly saw a huge colorful tiger lying lazily under a tree, sleeping soundly. Atsu's legs immediately turned to jelly. Fortunately, the colorful tiger did not notice it. Atsu hurriedly ran to the side and unknowingly went up another step. Then, it seemed to feel something and subconsciously looked around. Sure enough, as it slowly walked up the mountain, there were actually different kinds of exotic beasts staying here on each step of the staircase. There was a huge crocodile that was 10 feet long, a pure white single-horned rhinoceros, a flying black golden eagle, and even an auspicious spirit crane. Layer by layer, invisible lines seemed to be drawn on the mountain, allowing all the exotic beasts to live in harmony. What was strange was that they didn't seem to attack other animals. At most, they would roar in Atsu's direction in a threatening manner, and then Atsu would be so scared that he would piss his pants and flee. Although Atsu was a little afraid, for some reason, there seemed to be a strange impulse in its heart that kept encouraging it, making it look up at the highest point of the mountain. Vaguely there seemed to be a huge figure there. Atsu slowly approached that place. When it reached the top of the mountain, the black dog's legs were already trembling, and it looked like it could not hold on any longer. But soon it saw what it wanted to see. On the peak of this Doghead Mountain, there was indeed a huge figure lying on the ground. When that huge pair of eyes slowly looked towards Atsu, Atu suddenly cried out in joy. Then, it rushed over and happily cried at the huge beast that was the size of a small hill, wagging its tail with all its might. It was as if it had seen an old friend that it missed very much and wanted to please very much. It was an oxen, occupying the top of this mountain, the top of all the auspicious beasts of Mount Kunlun. Oxen glanced at Atsu, and Atsu barked happily, but there was no reaction from Oxen. After a moment, suddenly, Oxen swung its tail and stretched out, like the legendary immortal binding rope, instantly wrapping around Atsu's body, then threw it into the air and immediately flew far away. Woof! There was a shrill cry and countless beasts on and above the dog's head mountain heard the sound and looked over. They saw a black shadow flying down from the mountain, flipping several times in the air, then with a muffled thud, fell into a dense forest at the foot of the mountain, and did not move for a long time. It was deathly silent up and down the mountain. After a short while, everything suddenly returned to normal. All the beasts ate, slept and took a stroll. However, not a single one of them came over to take a look at the reckless black dog. 5 days later, Bai Chao Tang officially announced the list of disciples for this year's spiritual power training. There were 50 people and Lu Chen's name was among them. Exan was very happy and ran over to celebrate with Lu Chen, but Lu Chen spoiled the mood by telling her that they were even from now on, and that she did not owe him any favors, which made Exan roll her eyes for a while. But that was nothing. When Exan saw the dirty black dog lying in the room with several bandages on its body, she was shocked and immediately asked Lu Chen about it. Lu Chen did not know either. He only said that the stupid dog crawled all the way back from the forest a few days ago, and it looked very miserable. It seemed that when it was playing in the forest, it accidentally fell somewhere and broke several bones. It took Lu Chen a lot of effort to put it back together. Exan was so distressed that she hugged Atsu with tears streaming down her face. She comforted it softly for a while, and then ran out to buy a big bag of meat and bones, which was Atsu's favorite, and put it in front of Atsu to heal and replenish its chi and blood. The strange thing was, although Atsu was seriously injured, he didn't seem to have too many strange emotions. He ate and slept. When Exan came, he stuck his tongue out at her and licked her watch. Other than that, he didn't do anything else. So in the end, Exan could only think that Atsu accidentally fell and broke it. Then she told Atsu for a long time, which made it listless, yawn and finally fall asleep in her arms. Compared to Exan's soft-hearted nature, Lu Chen was much more straightforward. After helping Atsu connect its bones, changing the medicine and bandaging it, he kicked it to the corner of the room. In his words, this stupid dog was useless and always caused trouble for him. Sooner or later it would be better to stew it and eat it. Exan was so angry that she held Atsu and wanted to leave. However, Atsu was very affectionate with her, but when it was time to leave, it became merciless and hugged the corner of the table and stool, refusing to leave the room even if it died. In the end, it hid behind Lu Chen and no matter what Exan said, it would not come out. What kind of dog was this? Exan was about to lose all hope in this strange and rebellious black dog. She felt like she was about to break down. Anyway, Atsu was just an inconspicuous episode. Lu Chen's days in the Kunlun party continued as usual. After participating in the cultivation of spiritual power, the spiritual field could be put aside. Under the arrangement of the Bai Chao Tang, Lu Chen and 50 other handyman disciples who had good spiritual power left the rock mountain and came to another place under the Bai Chao Tang called Fragrant Garden. Fragrant Garden was a garden for planting important mystical materials. It covered a large area, but Lu Chen and other handyman disciples were only allowed to work in the outermost maple garden for the time being. The worst mystical materials that could be planted in Fragrant Garden were at least 2 veined. The deeper one went, the higher the grade. The fragrant spiritual chi lingered all day long, so it got the name Fragrant Garden. The work of Lu Chen and other disciples was in the outermost maple garden. In some spiritual plants arranged by the herb garden, they used their spiritual power to adjust the spiritual power of the 5 elements in the soil of the surrounding spiritual fields, so that these precious mystical materials could grow better. This was a very boring but very serious work. If one was not careful, it was very likely to hurt the fragile roots of the spiritual plants, and then damage the mystical materials. If cultivated properly, these precious spiritual plants would grow better than under normal circumstances, and the spiritual power and medicinal power contained in them would be more abundant. This was what Lu Chen did. When he was working, he looked like most people, a little funny and a little ridiculous. The handyman disciples all squatted in the spiritual fields with their hands inserted into the ground. Some of them even stuck their buttocks up. Then they held their breath and carefully activated the spiritual power in the soil. Rays of weak light flashed in the soil. After a day their bodies and faces would often be stained with black soil, looking a little dirty. They looked like the most ordinary farmers in the secular world. That day Lu Qin squatted in the spiritual fields doing his own work. There were a lot of Kunlun disciples coming and going in the flowing fragrance garden. Many of them were here to consume medicine, and there were also some who came to the 100-herb hall to purchase panacea pills. There were also some who directly spent spirit stones to ask the people of the 100-herb hall to help them plant some precious spiritual herbs and spiritual materials. When those high and mighty Kunlun disciples passed by, most of them would not look at those handyman disciples who bowed their heads like farmers. Occasionally there would be curious young people who looked at these people, and then let out surprised and funny sounds saying something like, "Those people look like toads," and so on. Of course, Lu Qin also heard some of these words, but his face was always calm, and no one could see any fluctuations in his heart. However, in the evening of that day when he finally finished all his work and stood up with his back aching, he suddenly saw a beautiful figure in the distance, with her back facing him, walking towards the depths of fragrant garden. Under the evening glow of that day, the scarlet feather cloak on her shoulders was like the burning clouds in the sky. Chapter 114. That woman's name was Su Qingjun. Lu Qin knew her name and knew that she was a talented disciple of the Kunlun party. At a young age she was only one step away from the realm of Jin Dan. She also had a famous and powerful master, Yuanying Jinren. Even because she was born in Tetsu, which was the weaker side, her master, Masato Kihara, and other elders of Tetsu had secretly pinned the hope of Tetsu's future rise on her. She was a proud daughter of heaven, a top genius of the Four Pillars, and one of the most dazzling young geniuses of the Kunlun party. In terms of momentum she was even better than He. An odd-job disciple like Lu Qin could only quietly watch her back from afar. The difference between them was like the difference between heaven and earth. Perhaps only the beautiful red feather cloak, which was like a burning flame, could make him feel a little familiar. It reminded him of the small mountain village, the mountain, and the swallows in the mountain. Lu Qin watched the woman's figure walk into the depths of the fragrance garden and disappear. Then he silently turned around and left. After entering the list of spiritual power cultivators and coming to work in the fragrance garden, Lu Qin's residence was also moved here. Compared to the previous house in the Stone Pan Valley, his current residence was obviously better. First of all, the space was half as wide, the house was much brighter, and there was a lot more furniture. There was even a desk in front of the window. Perhaps it was because of these intangible benefits that so many odd-job disciples flocked to it. When Lu Qin returned to his house, the sky was already dark. He pushed open the door and a black shadow flashed. Atsu greeted him. Atsu was a hybrid descendant of two kinds of monsters. Although it seemed that its combat power was very poor and it was very sorry to its parents, its recovery speed was very good. When it was first rescued in the land of chaos, Atsu's broken leg healed much faster than Xian's broken hand. It was the same now. A few days ago he had broken a bone somewhere, but now it was almost healed. Lu Qin squatted down and patted Atsu's head. Atsu wagged its tail and barked at him twice before looking out the door. "Do you want to go out and play?" Lu Qin asked. Atsu wagged its tail even more excitedly. Lu Qin smiled and said, "You're not afraid of anything. You just broke your bones and now you don't remember?" Woof 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 woof. Atsu snorted softly as if it didn't care at all. "All right." Lu Qin laughed and said, "Do whatever you want. I don't care if you want to be wild, but don't give me any more trouble. Also, it's dark now and there's a curfew outside. You can't go out at night. Let's wait until tomorrow." As he said this he turned around and closed the door. Because it was dark and there was no light in the room, the surroundings suddenly became dark, and only the outline of some furniture could be seen. Lu Qin walked to the bed and sat down and Atsu followed. In the darkness, Atsu's eyes began to gradually shine. It was a strange gaze with a little green, shining in the dark. It was a little scary, a little gloomy, and a little strangely beautiful like a pure and clear emerald. Lu Qin looked at Atsu's eyes for a while, then looked away lying on the bed and then quietly stopped moving. After a while there was a rustling sound on the bed. Atsu also jumped onto the bed, then quietly lay down next to Lu Qin. Its body curled up into a ball, and the two green spots in its eyes slowly disappeared, as if it had closed its eyes. The night was dark and time passed little by little. Finally it was late at night and there was no sound inside or outside the room. Then in the darkness Lu Qin, who had been quietly lying on the bed, suddenly opened his eyes. There was no change in his breathing and his heartbeat compared to before. Even the most sensitive peeper would have a hard time noticing the difference. In this darkness where he couldn't even see his own fingers, his pupils seemed to have merged with the surrounding darkness, like a quietly burning black flame. Inside and outside the room it was quiet. After waiting for a long time, he slowly raised his right hand and reached for his heart. Seeing that his palm was about to touch his chest, suddenly, another strange arm stretched out from the darkness and pressed on the back of his hand. Lu Qin turned his eyes to look. 2 balls of green flames slowly lit up in the darkness right beside him. And the hand that pressed on the back of his hand just now was a front paw of Atsu. Lu Qin was not surprised, nor did he panic. He just quietly looked at the strange eyes of Atsu in the darkness. After a while, he suddenly smiled and whispered, "Do you want to go too?" Atsu whispered as if it was a response. "Okay," Lu Qin said, then stretched out his other hand and held Atsu's body in his arms. In this process Atsu was very cooperative and did not struggle at all. From its body came a warm body temperature, adding some warmth to the somewhat cold night. In the darkness, Lu Qin hugged Atsu, then put his right hand on his chest again, took a deep breath and suddenly pressed down. The familiar feeling of floating and sinking suddenly hit him, and there was a roar in his ears, which seemed to be far and near. That moment seemed to be extraordinarily long, but after a moment, when Lu Qin inadvertently saw light in front of his eyes, his body had already changed places. Lu Qin and Atsu fell on the ground of the tree hole. Of course this fall was not serious, nor was it painful. At least, Atsu jumped up, then ran to the side excitedly, and began to smell around curiously. Lu Qin sat up from the ground and glanced at his surroundings. He had not been in this tree hole for a long time. The reason was of course the last time when he fought with White Lotus, the girl's sacred tree branch suddenly had a strange resonance with the seed on his body, and then both of them, including Atsu, were sucked into this place. Fortunately, on that day White Lotus was suppressed by some kind of power and had been unconscious in this tree hole, so she did not discover Lu Qin's biggest secret. Compared to the past, this tree hole had undergone great changes. The ancient mottled tree wall had regained some vitality, and the hazy green gas that wandered and entangled in the tree lines was also a lot denser. Lu Qin even saw some green buds on some of the tree wall that looked like burls on the branches. All of this, of course, was due to the essence that he squeezed out from the sacred tree branch that day. However, that was said to be the only branch of the sacred tree in the world. At that time, Lu Qin felt that the essence of life contained in it was as vast and endless as the ocean. Only that kind of incomparably abundant energy could revitalize this ancient tree hole. Among all the changes brought about by the tree of God's essence, the one that attracted Lu Qin's attention the most was not the changes on the tree wall in the ancient tree hole, but the silhouettes of 2 doors that suddenly appeared in the depths of the ancient tree wall, one in front and one behind. It was really just the outline because even if Lu Qin walked close and touched it with his hand, he could not find any gap at all. The 2 doors were like mysterious things hidden behind the hazy green gas and mottled bark. They could be seen but not touched and could not be opened. Lu Qin tried many methods but it was useless. Even if he tried to recall what he saw and heard when he lived in the devil cult, including all the legends of the devil cult that he had heard and seen, he had never seen anything similar to these 2 doors. The door was meant to be open, so what was the world behind the door? Lu Qin subconsciously thought back to that day. In his memory the sky was filled with starlight, and the seemingly boundless dark void. He suddenly felt a little cold. Woof 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 woof. A burst of barking came from the side and Lu Qin was awakened from his contemplation. He looked back and saw that Atsu had run to the side of the pond in the middle of the tree hole. It was lying on the side, carefully looking into the water, and occasionally barking into the water as if it was a little nervous. Lu Qin walked over and looked into the water. He saw that Atsu's shadow was reflected in the water and could not help but laugh. "Don't make a fuss, that's your own shadow." Atsu raised his head to look at Lu Qin. He snorted twice in a low voice, then suddenly raised his head to shout into the water. Woof 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 woof. Lu Qin was a little surprised and walked closer. He followed Atsu's gaze and saw that the black dog was lying on the side of the water, but its gaze seemed to pass through the reflection in the water, looking deeper into the clear water. He suddenly fell silent. He silently looked at Atsu, watching the dog that seemed to be nervous, and even the hair on its neck was slightly standing up. After a while he walked over, squatted down beside Atsu and hugged its head. In his arms, perhaps because it felt the familiar warmth and smell, Atsu quickly calmed down, no longer barking and nervous, and its body also relaxed. "It's okay, Luchin whispered to it, "It's just an annoying fire." Atsa did not answer, nor did it respond, but still quietly leaned against him. Luchin looked down, and through the water, he saw that in the depths of the clear water, behind the sparkling and swaying waves, a shadow gradually emerged. It was a black fire burning silently in the depths of the water. But the next moment, Luchin's pupils suddenly contracted. The black fire seemed to be a little bigger than in his memory. The black fire burned silently, and this familiar scene seemed to never disappear from his memory, like a demon forever engraved in the deepest part of his memory. Luchin slowly raised his head, frowned, and looked around at the ancient tree hole that seemed to be showing signs of life. He suddenly thought, in this vibrant place, could it be that the mysterious black fire also absorbed the power of life essence and slowly grew like this tree hole? Could it be that the black fire, like this ancient tree hole, had some kind of unimaginable life? Chapter 115. Half a month later, the group of 50 handyman disciples who came to the fragrance garden began to show their superiority in terms of spiritual energy cultivation, and Bai Chao Tang quickly divided them into two groups. There were 40 people on one side and 10 on the other. In the group with fewer people, the effect of spiritual energy cultivation was very outstanding. The spiritual plants cultivated by them grew much better than ordinary spiritual plants, and they even bloomed and bore fruit a day or two faster than the others. In the group with more people, most of the effects were more ordinary. Luchin was placed on the side where there were fewer people but had remarkable results. Although he only had one divine pillar of 5 elements of earth, and could only use the earth element spiritual power, the earth element spiritual power he absorbed and used was extremely pure, and the spirit herbs cultivated by him grew especially lush. He was one of the few people who had the best results. In the following time, the 40 handyman disciples were still working in the same place, while the 10 people led by Luchin were taken to another place in the fragrance garden, a place called Grass Garden. Compared with the original maple garden, the spiritual plants planted in the grass garden were obviously of a higher grade. There were almost no common two-stripe spiritual plants in the garden, and the ones that did appear were the most precious two-stripe spiritual materials. In addition, half of the area was already planted with 3-stripe spiritual plants. The heritage of a 5,000-year famous sect was inadvertently revealed in such a place. Even though Luchin had a rich history in the past, at this moment, when he looked at this herb garden and thought of the higher grade places in the depths of the fragrance garden, he could not help but be amazed. After arriving at the grass garden, Bai Chao Tang's attitude toward these 10 people also began to change, and more or less valued them. At the same time, because of the value of the spiritual plants in the grass garden, they were more attentive to Luchin and the others. Unlike in the maple garden, each of them was assigned a piece of land to take care of many spiritual plants. Here they were ordered to take care of only one spiritual plant, and for each kind of spiritual plant, there was a person who came to carefully explain to them the precautions and methods of cultivating this kind of spiritual plant. In the end, even Melaleuca japonica Jean Dan Fryer appeared here and personally exhorted them, telling them clearly that the spiritual plants here were invaluable, and in a sense even more valuable than the handyman disciples. All the handyman disciples listened quietly, no one refuted and no one resisted. Melaleuca japonica relaxed her expression, and then she told everyone in a pleasant manner that even so, if they took good care of the precious spiritual plants here, the harvest would be far greater than in the Stone Valley, and the hope of cultivation in the future would greatly increase. Luchin stood in the crowd and looked at the smiling old woman with white hair and a ruddy complexion. He thought to himself, what a good painting. As the disciple with the purest cultivation method and the most outstanding cultivation effect among this batch of handyman disciples, Luchin was assigned a very precious 3-striped spiritual plant, red ambergris. Red ambergris was an extremely precious spiritual plant, even among the 3-striped spiritual plants, and its nature was very strange. On an acre of land, only one red ambergris could grow, and there had never been a situation where two could grow side by side. Not only that, on the land where the red ambergris grew, there would always only be a special kind of grass called ginseng grass, growing around it, and no other trees, flowers, or plants would be able to survive. Even the trees that were deliberately transplanted near the red ambergris would wither and die on their own not long after. This was a very tyrannical spiritual plant, and it even did not hesitate to rob the lives of other plants to ensure its own space to grow. But at the same time, because of the amazing medicinal power of the red ambergris, it had a wide range of uses in the path of refining panaceas. Thus, for many years, the wild red ambergris had almost been dug out completely. Only a famous sect with a deep foundation like the Kunlun party had the ability to plant it themselves. When Lu Qin saw the red ambergris, he discovered that it was on an acre of land. In the center of the green grass, there was a spiritual plant with 9 tiny red ginseng ears, and it was particularly eye-catching. The red ambergris was a bit taller than the surrounding grass called ginseng grass, and it looked a little like a crane in a flock of chickens. But unlike its tyrannical growth habits, the red ambergris on the ground was actually quite delicate and cute. It had green stems and leaves that were more than a foot tall, and its color was tender. There were red ginseng ears on the top of its head, and there were 9 bright red fruits on the top of its head. They were full and bright red, giving people the urge to take a bite. Lu Qin looked at the red fruits for a while, then stretched out his hands and pressed them on the ground around the red ambergris, slowly inhaling and exhaling. A bright earthy yellow light bloomed from the ground, and the grains of soil seemed to tremble slightly. Then, very obediently, they moved closer to the red ambergris under Lu Qin's control. At the same time, under the ground that was invisible to the naked eye, the earth's spiritual power deep in the soil was also continuously gathering towards the roots of this spiritual plant. The red ambergris on the ground trembled in the wind, as if it was extremely happy. Even its stems and leaves danced with the wind, and after a while, the colors of the fruits on its head seemed to become brighter. Lu Qin withdrew his hands and exhaled. He stood up and walked around nearby, looking quite relaxed. About 100 feet away from his piece of land, there were a few other pieces of land where the other odd job disciples were cultivating other spiritual plants. When Lu Qin looked at them, he found that most of the odd job disciples were very cautious and careful. They were working diligently and didn't dare to be distracted in the slightest. Lu Qin smiled, shook his head and withdrew his gaze. Then he found a flat piece of land and directly lay down. There were green and soft ginseng grass everywhere around the red ambergris. It was a bit like a green blanket, and Lu Qin was very comfortable lying on it. He closed his eyes and laid down leisurely for a while. Suddenly, he felt that the light in front of him seemed to dim, and a shadow stood in front of him. Then a voice came. The voice was pleasant but seemed to be slightly angry. "Who are you? How dare you be so lazy? The red ambergris is a rare spiritual material. If something happens to it, what punishment will you bear?" Lu Qin opened his eyes and saw a figure standing beside him. The figure blocked the light from the sky, and for a moment he couldn't see the person's face clearly. But in that instant, he still saw the beautiful scarf on the person's shoulder like a burning flame. Lu Qin sat up, then patted his buttocks and stood up. Only then did he raise his eyes to look at the woman in front of him. This was an extremely beautiful woman. Her eyebrows were like a painting and her skin was whiter than snow. She carried a long sword on her back. Although the scabbard was simple and unadorned, there was a kind of faint fierce aura coming from it. It was obviously not an ordinary item. Could even be a famous ancient sword with a great origin. And on her shoulder, now that he looked closer, Lu Qin could more clearly see the scarlet, bright and gorgeous feathers on the shawl. It was the scarlet feather that he had seen at the edge of the sky pit in the mountain behind the small village. Su Qingjun. He smiled, took a step back and said with a calm and gentle expression, "Greetings, Shiji Su." Su Qingjun frowned, feeling slightly surprised. She said, "You know me?" Lu Qin's expression did not change. He said, "Senior sister, you have an illustrious reputation in the Kunlun party. There is no one who does not know of you." Su Qingjun snorted but did not say anything. She only looked at Lu Qin and said, "You are the odd job disciple who was sent to cultivate the red ambergris ginseng, right? This is such an important spiritual material. How dare you be so negligent? Are you not afraid that if the teachers of Baichao Tang see you like this, they will severely punish you?" Lu Qin was silent for a moment. He suddenly said, "If I remember correctly, Shiji Su, you should not be under Baichao Tang, right?" "Yes, why do you ask this?" Lu Qin sighed and said, "I was indeed arranged to cultivate this red ambergris ginseng, but I don't seem to have done anything wrong before. Perhaps you, Shiji Su, just saw me lying on the ground resting, and you find it a little unpleasant to the eye?" Su Qingjuan's expression darkened. She looked at this man more and more disliked him in her heart. But at this moment, when her eyes swept over this person's face, she suddenly felt a vague sense of familiarity. It was as if she had seen him before, but she could not remember at the moment. She was also too lazy to think so much. She only said coldly, "I am not under Baichao Tang, so naturally I will not meddle in other people's business. But this red ambergris ginseng is the one that grows the best and matures the fastest in the garden. It is of great use to me, so naturally I cannot allow you to casually trample on it. Only then did Lu Chen understand and said, so this red ambergris ginseng was decided by you. Su Qingjuan's first reaction was to nod, but suddenly she felt that there seemed to be something wrong with this person's words. It sounded a little awkward, but she just could not say anything, so she became more and more angry. With a cold face she said, don't talk nonsense with me. I only ask you, since Bai Chao Tang asked you to cultivate this red ambergris ginseng, why didn't you work hard? If the efficacy of the elixir deteriorates because of this in the future, wouldn't it be your fault? Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, Shiji Su, what are you trying to do by saying so much? Su Qingjun said, work hard and cultivate this red ambergris ginseng, otherwise I will not let you off easily. Lu Chen raised his eyebrows and said, that's strange. Where did you see that I didn't work hard and didn't cultivate this red ambergris ginseng? As he spoke, he looked at Su Qingjun with a faint smile on his face, and the look in the depths of his eyes seemed to be a little strange. Su Qingjun was an extremely intelligent woman. When she said this, she already faintly felt that something was wrong. She was usually obsessed with cultivation, and was not proficient in cultivating elixirs. The red ambergris ginseng was an important spiritual material that she needed today, but apart from its efficacy, she really knew nothing about how to cultivate this kind of elixir. Looking at the man in front of her who seemed to have something to rely on, Su Qingjun faintly felt that she might have said something wrong. It was just that she had always been used to being aloof. Everyone saw that she had outstanding talent and beautiful appearance, and on the surface they mostly gave in to her. Very few people would speak to her face like this. And at this moment, Lu Chen did not even wait for Su Qingjun to think further. He stood there and said, right Shiji Su, just now you said that you will not let me off easily. What do you mean by that? Chapter 116. When Lu Chen said this, he looked directly at Su Qingjun, and there was a hint of provocation in his words. However, looking at his calm expression and tone, he didn't seem to have any such intention. Su Qingjun obviously didn't seem to be a hot-tempered person. She didn't react to Lu Chen's words. Instead, she frowned and asked, from what you're saying, did I say something wrong just now? Tell me. If I'm wrong, I'll naturally apologize to you. Lu Chen was also startled by her words. He couldn't help but size up Su Qingjun again, looking at her with a whole new level of respect. It had been some time since Lu Chen joined the Kunlun party, so he had some understanding of this woman who was quite famous in the sect. In addition, in Kunwa City, Old Ma also privately inquired about a lot of information about Su Qingjun and passed it on to him. In fact, at this moment, Lu Chen knew a bit more about Su Qingjun than most people. No matter which aspect this young and beautiful woman was seen from, the word perfect seemed to be written on her body. She was very talented and was born to be a top genius of the four pillars. In terms of cultivation, she advanced very quickly, far surpassing ordinary people. She came from a good family, born in the largest aristocratic family in Kunwa City, the Su family. Since she was a child, she had been doted on by thousands of people. Heavenly treasures and delicacies were piled up like mountains. She had a deep background. In addition to the countless overt and covert forces the Su family had in the Kunlun party, her master was the leader of the Iron branch of the Kunlun party. Even if the Iron branch was currently weak, if the hope of the entire branch was entrusted to one person, no one in the Kunlun branch would dare to rashly provoke her. At such a young age, she even saw the glittering golden gate of the Jin Dan realm. Her future path was even more profound and broad beyond imagination. It was even rumored that Su Qingjuan's master, the wine-loving Taoist master Muyuan, had once let slip in his drunken stupor that his disciple might have a chance to pry into the legendary true sovereign realm in the future. Of course, this was only a rumor that couldn't be verified. Masato Kihara also firmly denied that she had said such a thing many times in the future. However, similar rumors didn't stop and quietly spread among the disciples of the Kunlun party. She seemed to have been born to stand above all living beings, and should have been revered and looked up to by all mortals. Yet, at this moment, she was suddenly able to say that she was sorry to Lu Chen. Lu Chen carefully looked at her eyes. The woman's eyes were clear and bright, as if there were no impurities, which made people subconsciously feel that all of what she said was true. Hello. Su Qingjun waited for a while and found that Lu Chen was only looking at her without replying. She couldn't help but frown and slightly raised her voice to call out. However, looking at her appearance, it was obvious that this girl had received the best etiquette since she was young. Perhaps it was because she was too beautiful and her temperament was too outstanding, so even if it was such a hurried call, it didn't make people feel uncomfortable. Lu Qin withdrew his gaze and laughed self-deprecatingly in his heart. He thought to himself, the gap between people is really big. After a pause, he pointed at the red amber ginseng on the ground and said to Su Qingjun, "Shiji Su, the cultivation of this red amber ginseng is particular about the 1/9 division. In other words, 1 part is cultivated and 9 parts is nurtured. As long as you do your part well and gather the earth attribute spiritual power in the spiritual field around the red amber ginseng root, the rest of the time, you just need to let it grow on its own." Su Qingjun looked a little surprised and said, "Is that so?" Lu Qin said, "This method was passed down from generations of ancestors in Baiqiao Tang. Of course I, a servant disciple, wouldn't dare to change it. If Shiji doesn't believe me, you can also go to Baiqiao Tang and ask." Su Qingjun nodded and said, "So that's how it is." After a pause, she said with some doubt, "According to what you said, this red amber ginseng seems to be very easy to cultivate? But in the past, when I went to Baiqiao Tang to look for this spiritual material, they all said that it was difficult to cultivate and very rare." Lu Qin smiled and said, "That's right. The Shiji brothers and sisters in Baiqiao Tang didn't lie to you. The red amber ginseng is indeed not easy to cultivate." As he said that, he squatted down and fiddled with the soil particles next to the red amber ginseng. He crushed a small piece of soil and said, "Although the red amber ginseng is idle most of the time when it is cultivated, the most important part of the time is that the spiritual power in the soil must be mobilized at a uniform speed and must be carefully returned to all the thin roots of the spiritual grass in the soil. At the same time, the earth attribute spiritual power absorbed and mobilized must be pure and gentle. Ordinary people can't do this step. It's not that the quality of the spiritual power is not high enough, it's that the control of cultivation is not good enough, it's that the red amber ginseng is one of the most difficult spiritual grass to cultivate." Su Qingjun glanced at Lu Qin and suddenly said, "So, among this year's servant disciples, you are very good at cultivating spiritual power?" Lu Qin said, "I am the best, so the Shiji brothers in Baiqiao Tang asked me to cultivate this red amber ginseng." Su Qingjun was startled. She didn't expect that Lu Qin would be so rude and modest, which was different from the people she usually knew. For a moment she couldn't help but find it funny. She shook her head and smiled, saying, "You are actually so confident?" Lu Qin smiled and didn't answer. Su Qingjun didn't look at him anymore. Her bright eyes were slightly bright as she stared at the red amber ginseng with 9 red pearls on its head. There was curiosity and joy in her eyes, as if she was very happy that she had just learned a new kind of knowledge. After a moment she suddenly squatted down as well. She didn't seem to care about the dirt of the soil in the spiritual field and used her white fingers to gently touch the red amber ginseng. The creation of the boundless world is mysterious. Even this little spiritual herb has such knowledge. It is really amazing. She had a smile on her face, but she softly praised. After a moment the two stood up together. Su Qingjun turned around and was about to leave when she suddenly stopped and looked back at Lu Qin. Lu Qin slightly lowered his head and said, "Shiji Su, is there anything else?" Su Qingjun looked at him and said, "Just now, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know the habits of the red amber ginseng, so I rashly criticized you. It was my fault." Lu Qin was silent for a moment and said, "Shiji Su, with your identity, you actually don't need to apologize to me." Su Qingjun lightly said, "If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. There is no need to cover it up. But then again, this red amber ginseng is really important to me. I hope you, I haven't asked for your name?" "Lu Qin." "Yes, junior brother Lu, please take good care of this spiritual herb. If it matures and its medicinal power is abundant, I will definitely reward you." Lu Qin smiled and said, "Senior sister, don't worry." Su Qingjun nodded and pondered for a moment, then said, "There is one more thing. Consider it me saying too much. Perhaps the red amber ginseng is like this and you also did your part. But lying down and sleeping casually in the spiritual field, no matter who saw it, inevitably gave people the impression that you are lazy and cunning. It is absolutely not good for you." Lu Qin took a deep look at this beautiful woman, then immediately nodded and said, "I understand. Thank you for the advice, senior sister." Su Qingjun made a sound of N and didn't say anything else. She turned around and left this spiritual field. A gentle breeze blew from afar, fluttering her thin and beautiful clothes. The fiery red scarlet feather shawl trembled on her shoulders, like a magnificent burning scene, stunning the passage of time under the light of the sky. When Lu Qin was caught slacking off in the fragrance garden, Atsu, who had almost recovered from his injuries, ran out of the house and went out to play. The surroundings of the new house were, of course, not the same as the one in the Stone Pan Valley. But because they were all in the mountains of Kunlun, most of the places were still mountains and forests. Therefore it didn't take much effort for Atsu to get used to the surroundings. Then it went into the forest around the fragrance garden to play. Compared to the freedom in the Stone Pan Valley, the forest around the fragrance garden was obviously much more vigilant. Needless to say, there were always people patrolling the periphery of the herb garden. Even in the forest, one could occasionally see 1 or 2 teams of patrolling disciples passing by. Obviously the Baichao Tang still valued this piece of land very much. Although Atsu wasn't a particularly powerful demon beast and didn't have any powerful abilities, its nose was very sensitive. In addition, its movements were considered agile, so it was very comfortable in the forest. When it encountered the disciples on guard, it would avoid them and there were no accidents. Everything looked normal and happy. Unfortunately, Atsu found that after searching for a long time, it still couldn't find the strange Doghead Mountain from that day. But this was actually normal. There was a distance from the Stone Pan Mountain to the Fragrance Garden. Moreover, the mountains of Kunlun were so big. The Doghead Mountain was hidden in the mountains, so it was really not easy to find it in a short period of time. But for some reason, Atsu still couldn't forget about the Doghead Mountain. Even when it was thrown off the mountain and injured, Atsu still wanted to go and take a look. Walking and running, Atsu still didn't find anything after crossing mountains and rivers. Seeing that it was getting late, Atsu could only turn around and go back. Anyway, there was still a long way to go. It would slowly find the Doghead Mountain in the future. The way home was not difficult for it. Following the smell, Atsu walked back. Seeing that the sky was gradually getting darker, Atsu also walked close to the fragrance garden. But at this moment Atsu's body suddenly trembled and it suddenly stopped in its tracks. In the forest ahead, in the dim light, a huge figure suddenly appeared there. Was that oxen? Atsu stopped in its tracks and stared at the bull from afar. There was some doubt in its eyes. It quickly found that oxen seemed to be standing in the forest, looking at something from afar. Atsu followed the green ox's gaze and saw that in front of the green ox, under the mountain forest, was the vast flowing fragrance garden. Pieces of neatly shaped spiritual fields were neatly arranged in the herb garden. Waves of fragrance of spiritual herbs and spiritual grasses, in this night breeze, faintly drifted in this mountain forest and diffused. Atsu looked at oxen. Oxen let out a low moo sound. It raised its head and deeply sniffed the air. Then, a trace of an intoxicated expression appeared on its face. Chapter 117. Atsu stayed in the forest about 100 feet away from oxen, watching the huge beast from afar. Of course, at the same time, it also saw oxen's strange movements and expression. Its eyes were filled with confusion, and it couldn't help but raise its head and sniff the air a few times. A dog's nose was very sensitive, so Atsu easily smelled the fragrance of elixirs drifting over from the direction of the herb garden. The smell was very pleasant, and it was slightly different from the usual fragrance. However, after sniffing it, Atsu only felt that although the fragrance was not bad, it wasn't to the point where it would be intoxicated by it. It became more and more curious and didn't go forward at that moment. Instead, it hid in the forest and watched oxen. It saw oxen standing in the forest for a long time, an intoxicated expression appearing on its face from time to time, and it often looked in the direction of the flowing fragrance garden with a hint of desire in its eyes. However, from the beginning to the end, Atsu didn't see oxen take a step in that direction. About an hour later, oxen seemed to be satisfied, and it suddenly turned and strode away, leaving this place. Atsu was shocked, and after a moment of hesitation, it still chased after oxen from a distance. Along the way, oxen didn't look back once. It was unknown whether it didn't notice that Atsu was following it, or whether it didn't care about the little black dog that was as small as an ant. Atsu didn't think too much about it and just followed oxen. It didn't know how long it had been walking in the mountains, but suddenly, the view in front of it widened, and a strangely shaped mountain peak appeared in front of it. It was a mountain that looked a little like a dog's head. Doghead Mountain. Atsu finally found the path that led to this place. Oxen slowly walked up the mountain, ignoring all the immortal birds and ferocious beasts at the foot and halfway up the mountain. And when they saw this oxen, all the animals immediately showed respect and humility, as if in this Kunlun mountain range, oxen was the king here. Atsu did not approach Doghead Mountain. It hid in a dense bush and watched as oxen climbed all the way to the peak of Doghead Mountain. Then it lay down like before. Atsu looked at the mountain and the countless animals on it. Its eyes gradually revealed a strong yearning, but there was still a hint of fear in its eyes. After a while, Atsu looked up at the sky and saw that it was already dark. After a moment of hesitation, it finally silently retreated and left the place in the shadows, running into the distance. Looking at it from behind, its figure was very lonely, like a black shadow running alone into the darkness that was about to descend. The next day, Lu Qin finished serving the red ambergris early in the morning. He then left Kunlun, descended the mountain, and went to Kunwu City. In this huge and lively city, when he stood on the street amidst the bustling stream of people coming and going, Lu Qin was in a trance for a moment. There were thousands of people on the street and everyone had their own happiness, anger, sorrow and joy and their own stories. Everyone had their own destination and everyone should also have their own home. But he had never thought that on this day on the street of Kunwu City, the 28-year-old Lu Qin suddenly thought of the word, home, for no rhyme or reason. Ever since he was young he didn't remember ever having a family. He couldn't even remember the faces of any of his relatives. As he stood on the street, lost in thought, past events and old friends flashed through his mind like a painting. What was a home? What did it look like? What did it feel like to have a home? A man and a woman together? Perhaps that was home? He thought for a moment, and Ding Dong's face flashed across his mind. Then he gently shook his head. He thought again about the memories that were buried even deeper in his heart. That once sweet and gentle face, that smiling woman in the desolate valley of the land of chaos, that person who once gave him the only trace of warmth in those turbulent, dangerous and dark years. He slightly lowered his head and silently walked forward. Then he once again suppressed that memory in his heart. The city was so big but he only had one place to go. In the Black Hill Pavilion in a secluded alley, the fat old Ma had a somewhat strange expression on his face. He looked at Lu Qin sitting across from him. He watched as Lu Qin slowly picked up his wine cup and drank it. Lu Qin didn't put it down but looked like he was deep in thought. Old Ma frowned and said, "What's wrong with you?" Lu Qin's body moved as if he was roused from his thoughts. He said, Old Ma said, "You seem a bit strange today. Did something happen in the Kunlun party?" "Oh, nothing happened," Lu Qin said perfunctorily. He poured himself another cup of wine and drank it. After a while, he suddenly looked at Old Ma and asked, "Old Ma, I want to ask you something." "Speak. Is there anyone else in your family?" Old Ma was startled. He said, "Why are you suddenly asking me this?" Lu Qin smiled and said, "It's nothing. I just thought of asking." Old Ma hesitated for a moment and said, "There's no one else. It's just me." Lu Qin glanced at him and something flickered in the depths of his eyes. He suddenly said, "You lied to me." Old Ma nodded and said, "You're right. I lied to you." Lu Qin snorted and said, "Why is that? You don't trust me?" Old Ma said, "We've been friends for 10 years. I can put my life in your hands in times of danger. Do you think I should trust you?" Lu Qin stared at his eyes and said, "Then why don't you tell me the truth?" "You know it. Why ask me?" "I don't know. Tell me." Old Ma suddenly laughed. But there was not much joy in his smile. After a while he said lightly, "You're an unlucky person. As long as you're involved with someone, they will often suffer misfortune, right?" Lu Qin suddenly stopped talking. He silently looked at Old Ma. His eyes were deep and distant like the dark sea. The room suddenly became quiet. There was not a single sound. A cold wind blew in the alley outside the house. It blew up some grass on the wall. It trembled in the wind and brought a little loneliness. After a long time, Lu Qin slowly put down the wine glass in his hand. He looked at Old Ma and said calmly, "Why do you say it so bluntly?" Old Ma shrugged and said calmly, "You asked me. I don't want to lie to you." Lu Qin grunted and lowered his head. He didn't look at him anymore. He seemed to be a little disinterested. After he looked away, Old Ma seemed to be relieved. He took the wine jug and refilled his glass. But suddenly he felt a little cold on his back. It was like a thin needle stinging. It was like the feeling of cold sweat. Old Ma stared at the wine in front of him. After a while he drank it in one gulp. "I met Su Qingjun and talked to her." Lu Qin's voice came from the front. Old Ma was excited. He looked at him and said, "How is it? You didn't really go to find trouble with that person, did you? Let me tell you. From the news I heard, Su Qingjun is a real genius. With your current strength, even 10 of you won't be a match for her." Lu Qin looked at Old Ma and smiled. A faint light flashed in his eyes. He said, "You're right. That's why I didn't do anything." Old Ma's face darkened. "You didn't do anything? Then you mean that you really have the thought of doing something? I say, can you be more honest? Focus on catching the traitor. Don't keep causing trouble. Lu Chen looked at old Ma with interest. That's strange. Why are you so sure that I'm causing trouble by getting close to Su Qingjun? Why can't she be the traitor? Old Ma was stunned for a moment. His face suddenly changed. His expression immediately became serious. He whispered, You suspect it's her? Everyone in the Kunlun party is now a suspect in my eyes, except for 2 people. Old Ma said, Who is it? Lu Chen pointed at him and said, One is you and the other is the damn Baldy. Old Ma smiled bitterly. He pondered for a moment and frowned. There are no less than 100,000 people in the Kunlun party, including the handyman disciples. If you think they are suspects, then we can forget about other things for the rest of our lives. We can't find them. So as you said before, the traitor should be someone with some ability and status. However, if it's Su Qingjun? Old Ma paused and said seriously, I don't think it's her. Lu Chen said, Why? Old Ma spread his hands and said, Because her family background is too good, and her background is completely clean. Coupled with her extraordinary talent, can you tell me one reason why such a person would want to walk the path of evil? Lu Chen smiled. He slowly picked up the wine glass but didn't drink it. Instead, he rubbed it between his fingers for a while. Then he suddenly said, Back then there was someone like you who said something similar. What? Old Ma asked. The elder of the evil cult, Yun Shouyang, my teacher. For some reason, Lu Chen's voice seemed to become a little erratic as he said faintly, When I first came to his side when I was young, there were people who also suspected me. After investigating for a while there were no results but they were still worried. Yun Shouyang smiled and said to them, In this world, how can there be a person who throws away the once-in-a-lifetime genius of the 5 pillars, not as a disciple but as a spy? The muscles on old Ma's chubby face suddenly twitched. Lu Chen didn't look at him. He just stared at the wine glass in his hand, lost in thought. After a while he suddenly smiled and drank the wine in the glass. Then he said to old Ma, You see, there is nothing impossible in this world. On that Kunlun mountain before the truth comes out, I don't believe anyone. A soft sound was heard. It was him gently putting the wine glass on the table. Then he stood up and turned to walk to the door. At the same time he said, Investigate the Su family, especially Su Qingjuan's childhood. No matter how big or small it is, tell me. Old Ma hesitated for a while and said, Okay. Lu Chen walked to the door and had one foot out, but suddenly his body stopped as if he had thought of something. After a moment of hesitation, he turned to old Ma and said, There is one more person. You should also investigate. Chapter 118. Who is it? Old Ma asked. The 10-year-old genius girl, White Lotus, from the Bai family in the city. Old Ma's expression changed as if he took a deep breath. He frowned and said, What are you doing? She's just a 10-year-old girl, not to mention she's a 5-pillar genius, and she's about to become Hakushin Jinkuan's disciple. You? His words suddenly stopped as if he had thought of something. He looked at Lu Chen, his mouth moved a few times but no words came out. Lu Chen looked at him quietly. After a moment he said, Don't forget, I was only 11 or 12 years old at that time. As for the disciple of a perfected monarch, a 5-pillar genius. He smiled with a hint of mockery on his face and then looked up at the sky. In the narrow and long sky above the alley, a white cloud floated across the blue sky. Old Ma's voice sounded behind him, sounding a little bitter. He said, I know, I'll look into it. Okay. Lu Chen responded, then walked out of the gate and walked into the distance. The days in the Kunlun Mountains were peaceful and stable, just like the clear water stream in the Qingshui Pond back then. It flowed every day so quiet that it was almost undetectable. In the fragrance garden, Lu Chen had gradually become familiar with the situation here. With his gentle temperament he also got to know many people here. Many of them were handyman disciples like him, and some were official disciples of Bai Chao Tang who were in charge of this area. As for his own job, the red herring ginseng, it was also growing well these days. It even looked a little more domineering. To be specific, the growth range of the ginseng grass around the red herring ginseng had expanded a little. Of course, Lu Chen did not feel sorry for the wild grass and trees that died because of the domineering red amber ginseng. Anyway, Bai Chao Tang had already reserved enough territory here. The bigger the area where the ginseng grass grew, the better the red ambergris grew. After that day Su Qingjun came again. After seeing the vitality of the red ginseng, it could be seen that she was in a good mood. Although she was not really happy, her attitude towards Lu Chen had improved a lot. However, compared to the spiritual fields in the Stone Pan Valley, the spiritual herbs in the Flowing Fragrance Garden were generally of a much higher grade, but they also took a much longer time to grow. The red amber ginseng had already grown to its current size, but there were still at least 3 months before it could be harvested. This kind of thing couldn't be rushed. Bai Chao Tang wouldn't do something like pulling the seedlings to help them grow. In fact, the current growth rate was already twice as fast as the growth rate of the wild red amber ginseng. This was because human cultivators were meticulously nurturing them, using their spiritual energy to take good care of them. However, as a result, Lu Chen was a little bored after finishing his daily work. But perhaps it was because Su Qingjun had said it once. Although Lu Chen didn't lower his head and admit defeat at that time, from that day onwards, he never fell asleep in the spiritual fields again. He began to wander around in the Flowing Fragrance Garden. However, because there were higher grade and priceless spiritual materials planted in the depths of the Flowing Fragrance Garden, part-time disciples like them couldn't go in for the time being. Therefore, the places he walked were basically in the grass garden. The grass garden's territory was actually quite large, and there were many kinds of spiritual herbs and spiritual materials planted here. Over the years, there were indeed many part-time disciples who worked here. However, to Lu Chen, the people closest to him and the easiest to befriend were naturally the group of miscellaneous affairs disciples who had come with him this time. After a period of time, he got to know the other 9 out of the 10 part-time disciples. The one he got along with the most was a 25-year-old man named He Changxing. The name He Changxing was very interesting. It sounded a bit rustic, but in fact it had a great vision. Wasn't the dream of millions and millions of people in the world to live forever? Therefore this name had long been overused by people. On the path of cultivation, immortality and becoming an immortal were practically the ultimate goals of all cultivators. Since ancient times, it seemed that no one had been able to achieve it, not even deity transformation stage true monarchs. He Changxing was also a very interesting person. He was a very diligent and down-to-earth person. He was very serious when dealing with people and had a good temper. In layman's terms, he was an honest person. However, he didn't know why his luck was a bit bad, so it seemed that He Changxing's life was a bit unlucky. 100 years ago, He clan was an outstanding clan in Kunwu City. However, 30 years ago no one remembered it anymore. He Changxing's ancestor was an outstanding figure. Moreover, he was a genuine Yuanying spiritual master of the Kunlun party. He was all-powerful and proud, but his fate wasn't too good. During a great battle in the Land of Chaos, he died tragically at the hands of the cruel devil sect's demons. The speed at which He clan declined was quite shocking. No one knew the specific reason. In short, from the time when they were a great clan, no one knew the reason. In He Changxing's generation, he unexpectedly had no connections to speak of. He Changxing loved to cultivate. Ever since he was young, he dreamed of restoring the glory of He clan's ancestors and restoring the He clan's reputation. He was very ambitious about this and prepared for more than 20 years. In the end, he sold all the family property left behind by his ancestors in exchange for an opportunity to see the immortal inspection mirror. However, fate was always full of malice toward honest people. The 5 elements divine disc in the immortal inspection mirror gave him a head-on blow. His talent was so poor that he almost couldn't step onto the path of cultivation. In the end, he bitterly begged for a position as a part-time disciple that seemed destined to have no future. This position also completely emptied out the last of his assets. Is it worth it? That afternoon, when the warm sunlight shone on the spirit fields in the Flowing Fragrance Garden, Lu Chen asked He Changxing this question as they sat side by side and chatted idly. Lu Chen looked very serious. He even used his hand to lightly gesture and said, "If you give up on the idea of cultivating and rely on the 2 old mansions left by your ancestors in Kunwu City, you might be able to live a peaceful and stable life. Why do you have to suffer here? It's not especially hard." He Changxing had the face of an honest person. He looked very ordinary, neither handsome nor ugly. He seemed to have a good impression of Lu Chen. Perhaps because the 2 of them had almost the same circumstances, he became closer to Lu Chen. Therefore, he smiled and said to Lu Chen, "Besides, if I muddle along in Kunwu City for the rest of my life, wouldn't it be completely hopeless?" "Hopeless." Lu Chen shook his head. He looked at He Changxing and said, "But I don't think part-time disciples have much hope. Since ancient times, I've never heard of a pillared disciple becoming a Taoist Yuanying." He Changxing nodded. He didn't seem to have any objections to Lu Chen's words. He said, "That's indeed very difficult. However, in our Kunlun party, there's a kind of high-grade spiritual medicine called the immortal swamp pill. It's said that it has the miraculous effect of improving the innate talent of disciples with insufficient talent. Moreover, the less talented the disciple, the better the medicinal effect. Lucien couldn't help but laugh. He shook his head and said, I've heard of the immortal swamp pill you mentioned, but it's a priceless treasure. The spiritual materials needed to concoct it are all heavenly materials and earthly treasures. Throughout history, only wealthy and noble clans would occasionally ask people to concoct a pill for them. Moreover, more than half of the time there's no effect. He then sighed and said, It won't work if you pin your hopes on this. He Changxing was silent for a moment before he nodded and said, You're right. Lucien glanced at him and said, What? Do you have other ideas? He Changxing grunted and said, Yes. Lucien's interest was piqued. He smiled and said, Let's hear it. He Changxing smiled and looked around. From time to time he could see part-time disciples of similar status working hard in the spiritual fields. He stared at those figures for a while and said, Our He clan has been mediocre for 3 generations. If I still don't pull myself together in the future, I have to continue the family line and have my own children. Don't tell me I'm going to let them live the lives of ordinary people? If I'm destined to lie at the bottom of Kunlun Mountain like this for the rest of my life, unable to get up and standing up, and can only struggle and work hard in this spiritual field for the rest of my life, am I going to let my children suffer like this in the future? He Changxing looked at Lucien and a rare bright light flashed in his eyes. It was a yearning and endless expectation for the future. He said softly, If I suffer a little more in this Kunlun Mountain, I will eventually accumulate some things. In the future, my children will be stronger than I am now. Even if he still can't do it, as long as he continues like this, my grandchildren will definitely be better. If this continues for a long time, there will be a day when our He clan will definitely prosper again. Don't you think so? He smiled and looked at Lucien, his eyes filled with the light of hope. Lucien looked at him quietly. After a while he said, Impossible, you must be dreaming. When Su Qingjun walked in from the outside of the fragrance garden, she hesitated for a moment when she reached the fork on the wide road. Finally she decided to turn to the grass garden to take a look. The red ginseng that was currently being planted there was the main ingredient for refining a panacea. Her master, Masato Kahara, had already told her that once the red ginseng matured and grew, as long as the medicinal effect was good, she would personally ask Chen Deng, who was second to none in Baichao Tang, to refine that rare panacea. Once the medicine was ready she could take the panacea and break through to the Jindan realm. The Jindan realm. She was only 22 years old. Such a young genius had never appeared in the Kunlun party in the past 200 years. Even though she had long been accustomed to her courageous and vigorous progress in cultivation since she was young, when she thought of the Jindan realm, she couldn't help but yearn and be excited. 2 people walked over from the road, one old and one young. Su Qingjun recognized the older white-haired woman. It was Jean Dan Friar of Baichao Tang Melaleuca Japonica. She hurriedly greeted her. Then she saw that the young girl beside Melaleuca Japonica looked somewhat familiar. Soon she saw the scar on the young girl's cheek, so she quickly knew that the young girl was EXN. That incident had caused a sensation in the entire Kunlun party. Of course she also knew about it. She smiled at EXN and EXN also smiled back at her. It seemed that on this sunny day the young girl was in a good mood. It seemed that she had gradually walked out of the haze of the previous day. After saying goodbye to Melaleuca Japonica, Su Qingjun walked towards the grass garden. But not long after she suddenly heard footsteps behind her. Looking back she saw that EXN was also walking quickly towards her. Chapter 119. EXN also saw Su Qingjun walking in front of her. Her footsteps paused for a moment before she walked over. She then smiled and greeted Su Qingjun saying, Shiji Su, are you also going to the grass garden? The road they were currently walking on was a side road that branched off from the main road and only led to the grass garden. Su Qingjun nodded and said, I have a spiritual herb planted there, so I'm going to take a look. What about you? Are you also going to see the spiritual herb? EXN smiled and said, Not really. I have a friend working there, so I'm going to see him on the way. Su Qingjun smiled, and the 2 young and beautiful women naturally walked forward side by side, chatting along the way. The 2 of them had similar backgrounds. They were both daughters of influential families in Kunwu City. Their ages were also about the same, so as they chatted they began to resonate with each other. For example, the beautiful scenery of Kunwu City and the stories of human relationships. They unexpectedly had quite a lot in common, so they suddenly felt a lot closer to each other. In the end, EXN sighed and said to Su Qingjun with a smile, "I didn't expect Sister Su to be such an easy person to get along with." Su Qingjun smiled and said, "What do you mean? Could it be that you've heard before that I'm not easy to get along with?" No. EXN promptly denied and said with a smile, "That's because Sister Su, you've been so outstanding since you were young. After I learned about you, I always felt that you were more powerful than ordinary people like us in every aspect, as if you were high up above us. I never dared to think that I could be so close to you." Su Qingjun smiled and her eyes were gentle, but when her gaze swept over EXIN's pretty and youthful face, she saw the scar on the side of EXIN's white and rosy cheeks, which appeared exceptionally abrupt and dazzling on that youthful face. Her heart trembled for no reason. When she looked at EXIN again, there was a hint of pity in her eyes. She wanted to ask about this matter, but she quickly suppressed this thought. She looked at EXN with a smile and chatted with her. It was as if she did not see anything wrong at all, as if the wound had never existed. Her expression seemed to become even more intimate. Just as they were about to reach the grass garden, a chirping sound suddenly came from above their heads. The two of them looked up and were startled. They saw a flock of about 8 or 9 birds fluttering their wings as they flew over their heads in a panic. EXN looked at the direction the flock of birds flew in and was shocked. Why are these birds flying into the grass garden? Su Qingjun furrowed her brows as well. She looked a little puzzled. The fragrance garden was a medicinal garden. All kinds of spiritual herbs and spiritual materials were planted, which were very valuable. However, since they were spiritual herbs rich in spiritual energy, in addition to being useful to human cultivators, they would naturally attract the covetous eyes of some birds and beasts. Therefore, in order to prevent spiritual materials from being damaged, Bai Chaotang built walls and fences around the fragrance garden, and sent people to patrol and guard, blocking all kinds of wild beasts in the forest on the ground. As for some birds that could fly, Bai Chaotang naturally had countermeasures. They set up some talisman formations around the spiritual fields in the fragrance garden, and from time to time emitted some aura that was feared and disgusted by the birds, so there had never been any birds around the fragrance garden. But today, this flock of birds suddenly flew in the direction of the grass garden, as if they did not have any scruples all of a sudden. It was really strange. Su Qingjun pondered for a moment and said with some uncertainty, "Perhaps the formation in the grass garden was suddenly damaged and lost its effectiveness? But there are guards and disciples patrolling the garden on weekdays. If it's just a few birds, it should be no big deal." EXN thought about it and nodded with a smile, saying, "Sister is right. Then let's continue." Su Qingjun agreed, and the two continued to walk towards the grass garden. As they walked, Su Qingjun looked up and saw that the sky was clear at the moment. The flock of birds that were flying seemed to be quite fast, and disappeared in the blink of an eye. They must have flown into the grass garden. Looking from afar, the grass garden was quiet, and it seemed no different from the past. But when she thought of those birds just now, for some reason, Su Qingjun suddenly felt a little uneasy in her heart. What had happened to the birds? In the grass garden, Lu Qin and He Changxing stood opposite each other, and He Changxing's face did not look very good. "Why?" He Changxing asked Lu Qin in a low voice, frowning deeply. It was obvious that he was unhappy. Lu Qin looked at him for a while, then said, "You want to hear the truth?" "Yes." "You are only a servant disciple and your family has declined. You sold all your family's assets, and you have no one to help you other than yourself. You think that if you rely on yourself, you won't be able to leave much for your future children." Lu Qin said calmly, completely ignoring He Changxing's pale face. "You think that one day the descendants of the He family will one day rise again. Let's not talk about whether or not your descendants will be as stubborn as you, but have you ever thought that with your status, it is impossible for your children to enter the Kunlun party on their own? They will also have to go through the barrier of the immortal mirror. So, even if you work hard all your life and save something for your child, as long as one thing happens, it can easily turn your life's hard work into nothing. What is it?" He Changxing couldn't help but ask. Lu Qin sighed. "What if, after a few decades, the Kunlun party suddenly increases the fees to participate in the immortal mirror?" He Changxing's entire body trembled. His eyes widened. "Impossible. The Kunlun party is a famous sect, they can't." "What if?" Lu Qin interrupted him with a question of his own. He Changxing murmured, "What if, among this year's batch of servant disciples, there are many who bribe their way in? Do you really not know? It's only a matter of a few words. If someone really lacks money and becomes shameless, who will you go to reason with? Yi Changxing was tongue-tied and at a loss for words. His expression was unsightly like ash. Lu Chen looked at him and stretched out a hand, palm facing up. Look, in this world people are born differently. Some people are born to stand at the top and there are others like you, me. He slowly turned his palm over and gently pressed it towards the ground. Watching the movement of his palm, Yi Changxing's body seemed to tremble slightly. His eyes didn't blink, but they seemed to have lost their previous brightness. Lu Chen pressed his palm very low, then said softly, "Think about it yourself. What right do you have to make a comeback?" Yi Changxing raised his head, looked at him and said, "Could it be that people like us will never be able to take another step forward in our lives? Could it be that our children and grandchildren can only be people under this person? Achieve immortality, ascend to the heavens on the great Tao, and all living beings have the fate of immortality. Aren't these words passed down from the golden mouths of our ancestors?" He looked a little agitated, even a little angry. "Fate of immortality there always has been." Lu Chen said, "But how small is the hope? Will the 100,000 people in Kunlun coincidentally fall on your head?" Yi Changxing took a deep breath, his expression seemed to calm down a little and said, "If that's the case, then why are you telling me so much?" Lu Chen looked at him and said, "I just feel that you don't need to pin your hopes on the next generation. If there is fate of immortality, you can make a comeback in this life. If there is no fate of immortality, it's useless even if you struggle for a lifetime and pass it on to your children and grandchildren." Yi Changxing was silent for a long time and said, "That makes sense." In the spirit fields, that man turned around and picked up the hoe, looking like he was going to work diligently again. Lu Chen stood at the side and looked at him with interest and said, "What, depressed?" Yi Changxing didn't even raise his head and said, "Yes, but no matter how depressed I am, I still have to work." Not waiting for fate of immortality? Of course, why not? What if a pie falls from the sky and hits me? Lu Chen smiled and said, "If you have such luck, why don't you try to see if there's lightning in the daytime on this sunny day?" Yi Changxing raised his head to look at the sky, and Lu Chen also raised his head to look into the distance, only to see that the sky was blue, and there was no movement at all. After a moment, the two withdrew their gazes and looked at each other. Lu Chen spread out his hands. Yi Changxing shook his head and said, "That kind of thing is too unreliable, how can there really be?" He suddenly cried out and covered his head with his hand. Something fell from the sky and just happened to hit his head. Lu Chen, who was standing at the side, was also startled and subconsciously said, "It can't be so coincidental." After a moment, the two looked at the same time and then they were both startled. They saw that the thing that hit Yi Changxing's head was a ball of fluffy, and at this moment, it was thrown to the ground. Looking closely, it was a small bird. Yi Changxing bent down to pick it up and held it in his palm to look at it and said to Lu Chen, "It's dead." "Dead bird?" Lu Chen was also surprised. Right at this moment they heard a series of chirping sounds. The two of them looked up and saw a flock of about 4 to 5 birds flying over their heads in a panic and anxiously. "Why are there birds here?" Yi Changxing asked in puzzlement. "I don't know." Lu Chen was also a little puzzled. He then glanced at the dead bird in Yi Changxing's hand, only to see that it was the most ordinary of chickadees, only half the size of a palm. At this moment, its dead body was curled up into a ball, as if even at death's door, this bird seemed to be unusually terrified. At this moment, a trace of uneasiness suddenly flashed in Lu Chen's heart, but he didn't know where this feeling came from. He also didn't know that not long ago, a similar feeling arose in Su Qingjuan's heart at the entrance of the grass garden. He turned around and looked at the few small birds flying far away, watching them flapping their wings in panic, desperately flying into the distance as if they were fleeing for their lives, and in the blink of an eye, disappeared into the distant mountain forest. He silently thought for a moment and suddenly looked back, only to see that on the path of those birds, the undulating mountains of Kunlun, like a silent giant standing between heaven and earth. The mountains were deep and seemed to be locked in a dense fog. Chapter 120. In the forest not far from the fragrance garden. Black Dog was hiding in the dense thicket, carefully looking forward through the gaps between the branches and leaves. Oxen had come here again today, looking at the fragrance garden from afar, and then showing a strange expression of longing and intoxication. These days, Atsu had been waiting here almost every day, and then it found that Oxen was indeed not passing by here by chance. About every 2 or 3 days, Oxen would come here and stay for half a day, looking at the medicine garden in the distance with a drooling expression, or it could be said that it was intoxicated by the fragrance of the medicine. Atsu had a vague feeling that oxen should be very interested in something in the fragrance garden, and it was not just smelling the fragrance of the medicine. However, even though its nose was very sensitive, it still could not distinguish the special things in the fragrance in the air. So it could only wait here. In fact, it really wanted to go to Oxen's side, but the last encounter on the Doghead Mountain made it understand the gap between them, so it did not dare to take a step forward for the time being. However, Atsu was a dog that was smarter than it looked, even though it was often called stupid dog by its owner. Atsu felt that Oxen should be a very powerful beast, and it also felt that if it could stay by this beast's side, it would be safer than before. Therefore, Atsu decided to seize this opportunity. It boldly tried to take a step towards Oxen, but Oxen did not respond. Atsu hesitated for a moment, and then took a few steps forward. Suddenly, Oxen raised its head. Atsu's heart skipped a beat, and it almost knelt down. However, it soon realized that Oxen was not looking at it, but was looking up at the sky. In the air above the mountain forest, a few chickadees flapped their wings and flew over their heads, looking a little anxious and panicked. One of them seemed to be exhausted and flew with great difficulty, falling behind the other chickadees. In its panic, it suddenly couldn't dodge in time and crashed into a thick branch. Immediately there was a flapping sound and then it fell from the sky. With a pew sound, it smashed right between the two huge horns of the green ox, then rolled down and finally landed on the ground. Atsu looked at the bird, only to see it twitching and rolling on the ground a few times before it slowly quieted down. Its body curled into a ball and there was no sound. Oxen, who was as tall as a hill, slowly lowered his head and looked at the little chickadee on the ground. Atsu couldn't help but take a few steps forward, and then it saw the situation clearly, confirming that the bird was dead. Oxen silently looked at the little body on the ground that had lost its life, and its huge eyes that were like copper bells flickered. No one knew what it was thinking at this moment. After a moment, it lowered its head a little and sniffed the body of the chickadee. Then it seemed to be startled for a moment as if it had sensed something. Oxen stood where it was for a while and suddenly gave a low cry, then it turned around and strode away. Its steps were much faster than usual, and in the blink of an eye, it disappeared into the depths of the forest. Atsu wanted to follow, but after a few steps, it found that it could not catch up no matter how hard it tried. Atsu stopped in a daze. After a while, it also walked to the side of the dead chickadee with some doubts. It sniffed for a while, but it seemed that it did not find any clues, and it still had a puzzled look on its face. Atsu looked back at the place where Oxen had gone. After a moment of hesitation, it turned around and walked down the forest towards the house where it and Luchin lived. Luchin came back in the evening. On this day he also met Su Qingjun and Exan in the grass garden. To his surprise, these two women seemed to have become friends, but they obviously did not know each other's relationship with Luchin, so when they found out that they came to the grass garden for the same destination, they could not help but be very surprised. One was looking for someone, and the other came to see the spirit plant red amber ginseng. Although the purpose was slightly different, this was also an amazing coincidence. The two women were surprised, but they could not help but be happy. It seemed that the distance between them had inexplicably become a little closer, and they chatted more happily, leaving Luchin aside. However, Luchin was not anyone to them. He could still be friends with Exin, but with Su Qingjun he was not even friends, so he did not feel that there was anything wrong. In short, after a while of chatting he came back. In some dim light he saw the figure of Atsu lying at the door. He went forward to greet it, and Atsu greeted him warmly. Everything seemed to be the same as usual. Before entering the house, Luchin looked at the sunset in the sky and saw that the red sunset in the western sky was like fire, as if the whole sky was burning. Under the same sky, there were also many people who saw the unusually gorgeous and beautiful sunset. Su Qingjun stood in front of her master Masato Kihara's immortal's cave and looked into the distance. Exn leaned against the window of her house on Rock Panshan. On the peak of the sky between the clouds, in the world of ice and snow, the beautiful and otherworldly girl who was like a banished immortal also raised her head. The sunset was reflected in her eyes, like a raging flame, which formed a sharp contrast with the howling wind and snow behind her. And in Kunwa City, in a secluded alley, a fat man was drinking wine and smacking his lips. Looking at the sunset in the sky, he then muttered, "What the hell is this? It's so ugly." After night fell, the sky darkened. Darkness swallowed everything in the sky, even the wild and burning clouds were covered. After entering the house and closing the door, there was a feeling of being isolated from the outside world. Lu Chen lit an oil lamp. In the light of the lamp, Atsu was walking back and forth in the room. For some reason it suddenly seemed a little uneasy. Several times Atsu approached the door and tried to pry open the latch as if it wanted to go out. Lu Chen stopped it and said, "It's so late. Don't go out and play." Atsu turned around and looked at him. It was a little hesitant, but it seemed it wasn't too sure about something, so it turned around and lay down at Lu Chen's feet. Lu Chen smiled and patted its head. He then said, "It's late. Go to sleep." He blew out the candle and lay down on the bed. After a while he suddenly heard some movement next to him. Atsu jumped up and snuggled up to him. Lu Chen reached out to hold its body and put his hand on Atsu's belly. Sensing that Atsu still seemed a little uneasy, he asked, "What's wrong?" Atsu called out in a low voice, but it didn't seem to have anything wrong. Soon after, it lay there obediently. Then there was no more movement in the darkness. After a while Lu Chen's breathing became long and steady. He seemed to have fallen asleep. At the same time 2 green spots of light slowly lit up beside him. It was Atsu opening its eyes in the darkness. It stared at the deep darkness as if it was waiting for something. That night was originally very quiet. The boundless mountains of Kunlun were bathed in the darkness of the night, just like countless years in the past. The forest was quiet and the mountain breeze was gentle. Occasionally on the mountain road in the depths of the night, a group of guarding disciples would pass by. The entire Kunlun mountain looked like a giant beast sleeping quietly. Until a ray of light suddenly appeared. It was in the deepest part of the Kunlun mountain range. It was an area covered with dense fog and auspicious clouds. It was the first forbidden area that no one except the perfected immortals of the Kunlun party could step into. A light suddenly appeared. It passed through the fog, broke through the clouds and went straight up to the sky. The clouds dispersed and the wind and clouds in the sky changed. It was as if the sky had been pierced with a wound. But soon the light dissipated. During the whole process the light seemed to be earth-shattering, but it was silent. Then, in the Kunlun mountain range, everything suddenly stopped. The trees and the wind seemed to freeze at that moment. In a small hut, Lu Chen suddenly opened his eyes and sat up from the bed. His eyes were shining in the darkness. Deep in his pupils, there seemed to be a flame burning. It was a black flame. Boom! A loud noise came from the depths of the earth. It was as if the world was splitting apart. Therefore, the entire land and the entire Kunlun mountain range suddenly began to tremble violently. The wind suddenly rose and the forest howled. Everything suddenly trembled violently. All the houses were rattling. Wave after wave of tremors swept past the depths of the earth like a raging tide. Then all the insignificant things were shaken to the side. In the hut, Atsu jumped up in panic and barked wildly. But soon, it suddenly quieted down and looked in horror at the man struggling on the bed. Lu Chen curled up his body and tried his best to suppress his hoarse voice. But his throat could not help but cry out in extreme pain. On his body, every corner and every part of his skin suddenly ignited with black flames. The flames danced wildly in the darkness, like the grin of a demon that had been waiting for many years. It was incomparably arrogant and hardy, watching the man struggle in despair. His clothes were undamaged. The strange thing was that the sudden black flames did not even burn Lu Chen's skin and flesh. But the bone-deep pain seemed to make him return to hell again. The black flames reignited and burned his soul. Amidst the endless pain, Atsu's barking that seemed to be far away yet close at the same time, Lu Chen suddenly felt something. He raised his head with difficulty, and at that moment, his face seemed to be burning with black flames. Following his gaze, all the black flames seemed to float to the distance at the same time. It was as if somewhere in the depths of the night, there was something that made these black flames simultaneously revere. Lu Chen held onto the bed and slowly stood up. The black flames danced and burned wildly on his body, but he gradually calmed down. He looked down at his flesh and skin that was not damaged by the black flames. Then he looked up again and stared into the distance at the depths of the Kunlun mountain range. After a moment he suddenly smiled. In the black flames, his smile seemed to be painful and ferocious. Chapter 121. At midnight, Kunlun mountain shook violently. A thunderous sound came from the ground. The wind and clouds changed color, the stars went astray, the mountains collapsed and the rivers boiled. In a flash it spread outside the mountain. Kunwa city seemed to be facing a huge wave. Countless pavilions collapsed and the whole city was noisy. Men and women went out on the streets. Many of them were naked and looked very embarrassed. There were many casualties and injuries. At dawn, the Kunlun party sent many disciples down the mountain to help the people in danger. Because of this, the people calmed down and the situation gradually eased. Not to mention the chaos in the city at the foot of the mountain in Kunlun Mountain, there were continuous aftershocks that night. The ground shook more than 10 times until dawn. Under the morning light, the mountains were still majestic, but many places were broken. It was clear that the damage last night was terrible. Fortunately, the Kunlun party was a famous cultivation sect with many profound disciples. The headmaster, Idle Month, was able to command and quickly stabilize the situation. Around noon, the Kunlun party was already in order. Not to mention handling the chores, Immortal Idle Month also looked smart and capable. Even if the incident happened in a hurry, he still handled it with ease. At this moment he was in the Xingyang Hall on the main peak of the Kunlun party, Tiankuan Peak. He ordered his disciples to do things one by one. More than 10 groups of people came and went, and none of his orders were repeated. After the last group of people left, Immortal Idle Month also let out a long breath. He took a sip of the spiritual tea on the table and glanced at the cup. He saw that the tea leaves in the water were small, delicate, and strangely shaped. They looked like auspicious animals and cranes. When they floated in the water they looked like cranes dancing. It was very magical. The tea was mellow. It was the famous tea of the E family in Kunwa City, Little Crane. Immortal Idle Month stared at it for a moment and put the cup aside. At the same time he didn't look relaxed. He must be worried because of the earthquake last night. At this moment he suddenly heard footsteps coming from the rear hall of the main hall, walking towards him. After a moment, a figure appeared. It was his junior brother Zhuoxian. Perfected Idle Month was a little surprised. He looked at Zhuoxian and asked, "Junior brother, why are you here?" Zhuoxian bowed to him, but the expression on his face was somewhat serious. He quickly stepped aside, revealing a petite figure behind him. It was a beautiful young girl, White Lotus. At this moment, White Lotus's expression was chilly while she held an ancient jade disc in her hands. The disc was around a foot in size and its center was pure white. Strange talisman markings flickered successively in a circle around it, and it seemed as if a mysterious energy was effusing out from it at all times. Wind Whisper Disc. Perfected Idle Month was shocked. She hurriedly got down from her seat and strode in front of White Lotus. With a solemn expression, she bowed respectfully to White Lotus. The perfected headmaster of Kunlun had a very high status. However, White Lotus did not move away from such etiquette. She did not make a sound and only stood there expressionlessly. Zhuoxian, who was beside her, did not seem to be moved at all. After a moment, the jade disc in White Lotus's arms suddenly shone brightly. More than 10 talisman markings lit up at the same time. The pure white light swayed and gathered, forming a light screen in the center of the jade disc. A sharp whistling sound of wind and snow suddenly came from the Wind Whisper disc. The light screen trembled and gradually became clear. It showed a sky full of whistling wind and snow. Other than that, nothing else could be seen. Perfected Idle Month and Zhuoxian stood together and said respectfully at the same time, "Greetings, Master." "Forget it." A low and desolate voice came from the depths of the wind and snow in the jade disc. It seemed as if it came from behind the wind and snow, but it also seemed as if it was far away, an unreachable place. Perfected Idle Month straightened his body and revealed a trace of a smile as he looked at the girl. It was also at this moment that White Lotus's face showed a trace of expression. She lowered her head slightly and said softly, "Senior brother sect leader, White Lotus has been impolite." "It's all right," Perfected Idle Month said kindly. He then looked at the Wind Whisper disc and said respectfully, "Master, you suddenly used the treasure disc to meet me. Do you have something important to tell me?" The ancient Wind Whisper disc flashed with spiritual light. The wind and snow became stronger and the old and distant voice also came. "After the earthquake, is the sect still stable?" Perfected Idle Month said, "I have already handled everything properly. The people on the mountain and at the foot of the mountain are not in a mess. Now the rescue and restoration work has begun. Please rest assured, Master." Good. Perfected Idle Month pondered for a moment. He then looked at the Wind Whisper disc and asked tentatively, "Master, I felt that the beginning of the earthquake last night seemed to come from the ground between the clouds and the sky, including the strange light that shot into the sky at the beginning of last night. Is there any damage in the Forbidden Land?" "No." Perfected Idle Month looked down slightly and said, "Yes, I understand." Whoa. A sudden gust of wind seemed to blow in the Wind Whisper disc and hit the light curtain. Although it did not spread outside the light curtain, the lifelike appearance still seemed to make people feel a chill in their hearts. At the same time, the old and low voice came again in the wind and snow. Idle month, write a letter immediately and send it to Immortal City. Perfected Idle Month's expression changed slightly. She said, Master, you are asking Martial Uncle Tianlan? Ask Junior Brother Tianlan to come back to the mountain to see me immediately. The voice was like tearing silk, mixed with the wind knives and snow swords. It seemed to have its own fierce momentum, causing the spacious hall to become cold in an instant. Perfected Idle Month immediately said, Yes, disciple obeys. On the wind-whispered disc, the wind and snow were still blowing mournfully, but the sound gradually became smaller and the picture gradually faded. Just like that, it slowly darkened until it disappeared. Lu Qin did not sleep all night. When the Kunlun mountain was shaking and the earth was shaking, he still stayed quietly in his house, quietly looking at the deep darkness in the distance. The sudden black fire was reignited, burning on his flesh and blood. But this time, the black fire was obviously different from the black fire curse that had entangled him for the past 10 years. Although there was also an indescribable pain that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, his flesh was not damaged at all. The black fire just danced wildly on his body, like a reluctant devil, but could no longer hurt him. Lu Qin waited quietly. When the sky was about to brighten and the earthquake finally stopped completely, the black fire on his body seemed to calm down and slowly converge. He just stood there, standing in the black fire, and then slowly stretched out his right hand. The black fire, like a receding tide, receded from his whole body. From his head to his feet, the black fire piled up in waves and then converged into a silent fire flow, finally flowing into the palm of his right hand. It condensed into a black flame, quietly burning in the palm of Lu Qin. Lu Qin looked down at the black flame and did not speak for a long time. There seemed to be a light in the depths of his eyes, echoing with the black fire. At the same time, he could clearly feel that in his sea of qi and dantian, the original rough five elements disc had turned over again, revealing the other side of the deep darkness like the endless night. The black divine disc. But there was no small black fire. Lu Qin quietly looked at the black fire in the palm of his hand. Suddenly, his 5 fingers closed and slowly clenched. The next moment he suddenly clenched his hand into a fist. In his ears, in a strange and distant place, there seemed to be a sudden explosion of thunder. A few ripples that were hard to see with the naked eye suddenly appeared around his body, like silk threads in a storm, violently trembling, drawing strange lines and ripples in the void. Pa 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 pa, a series of crisp sounds rang out. A strange sound came from beneath his feet at the same time. Lu Qin looked down and saw that the ground beneath his feet had suddenly cracked open. A chair not far away from him, on the side closest to him, suddenly turned into powder without a sound and scattered to the ground. After a moment, the remaining half of the stool fell woodenly, falling to the ground with a pa sound. Lu Qin stood in the same place, silent for a long time, and then slowly stretched out his palm again. The black fire had disappeared. After a moment, he looked at his abdomen, under his flesh, in the sea of qi, on the incomparably strange black divine disc, a cluster of black fire reignited, quietly burning in the deep darkness. Then, as if the night was about to pass, as if the sky was sprinkling again, as if the sun and moon were rotating, his 5 elements disc slowly turned over. The darkness gradually receded, and the light slowly came. In the light, the black side turned over, and what reappeared was a familiar pillar of the divine disc. As a result, he became the ordinary Lu Qin, the small odd-job disciple like an ant. Lu Qin raised his head and looked into the distance, only to see that the sky was already bright. In the distance, the Kunlun mountain range was towering, as if it did not care about the earthquake last night, already standing in the world like a giant. After all, the darkness belonged to the night. After dawn, there was no trace of it. He let out a long breath, turned around, and just when he was about to call out, he was suddenly startled. He did not see the figure of Atsu in this room. Lu Qin subconsciously looked at the door, only to see that the door was still closed. Although there was a big earthquake last night, the house was also damaged, including several cracks on the wall, but it did not collapse and was generally still intact. Lu Qin frowned and called the name of Atsu a few times, but there was no response. He became more and more puzzled. He searched the house for a while, and then found a small hole in a remote corner at the back of the house. Looking at the size, it seemed that Atsu could barely pass through. Did that dog run out of here? In this panic, everywhere was a mess. Where would this stupid dog run to? Lu Qin looked at the dog hole in the corner speechlessly. After a moment of silence, he stood up, walked to the door, opened the door and walked out. The sky suddenly sprinkled light, and suddenly there was a bright white in front of him. Lu Chen narrowed his eyes subconsciously. At that moment, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Isn't the sky the same as usual? Why is it suddenly so dazzling today? Chapter 122. After the great earthquake in Kunlun, the mountain and the foot of the mountain were in a mess. Under the command of the headmaster, Reverend Idle Month, coupled with the fact that the disciples of the famous sects were indeed outstanding, the situation of the Kunlun party was soon stabilized. Many chores such as disaster relief, repairs and so on were carried out one by one, so no one panicked. However, the impact of this earthquake was very great. In many places walls and houses collapsed. Although the casualties in the Kunlun party were not as high as in Kunwa city at the foot of the mountain, the troublesome thing was that because the epicenter of the earthquake was deep in the mountains, many places had mountain ridges shifted and rivers changed course. The consequences caused by this were also very troublesome. The most important medicinal garden of the Kunlun party under Baichao Tang Liuxiang Garden was one of the places that suffered the worst damage. In the originally flat area of the herb garden, there were many huge fissures in the ground, and at the same time, all kinds of oddly shaped rocks and soil were everywhere. They were formed by the huge distortion and compression of the ground during the calamity last night. Under such a natural disaster, the countless treasures and precious spiritual plants in Liuxiang Garden could be considered to be very unlucky. Large areas of the precious medicinal garden were directly destroyed. Many spiritual plants were either broken or damaged, all kinds of fruits and leaves fell, or all of them were buried in the soil by the uprooted rocks and sand. The most unfortunate thing was that the spiritual plants that just happened to grow above those unfathomably deep fissures directly disappeared after the disaster, and no one knew where they went. At present, everywhere in the Kunlun party was busy. The other halls had their own problems and couldn't take care of Liuxiang Garden. Baichao Tang also had many foundations, so they temporarily lacked manpower and couldn't send many people to help here. They could only first protect and rescue those extremely valuable and rare treasures in the deepest part of Liuxiang Garden. As for the periphery, they couldn't take care of it for the time being. At dawn, Black Dog came to the place outside the Liuxiang Garden. Compared with usual, the situation of this place, which was originally tightly guarded, looked very bad. Although the erected high walls and fences hadn't completely collapsed cracks could be seen everywhere. It was almost as if there were none. Looking through the cracks, the situation in the grass garden was also miserable. The soil was tumbling and the plants were falling. It was like a grassland and there were not many people around. Atsu craned its neck to look around for a while, then turned its head to look at the forest in the distance. Usually, that oxen would hide there and secretly peep at the fragrant garden, making strange movements and expressions. Atsu stood there and thought for a while. Then he tiptoed into the grass garden through a crack. As soon as he entered the grass garden, the fragrance of spirit medicine in the air suddenly became much stronger, even stronger than usual. The reason for this should be the broken spirit grass and trees that could be seen everywhere, probably emitting their last breath. The scene was rather miserable. Atsu carefully looked around for a while. After confirming that there was no one nearby, it began to sniff and move forward, as if it was looking for something. In a medicinal garden like the fragrant garden, the most abundant thing was, of course, spirit grass. Therefore, it didn't take long for Atsu to see the spirit grass that was usually very precious. However, most of them were now buried in the soil or broken and listless. Atsu looked at them for a while and didn't seem very satisfied, so it continued to move forward. The grass garden was quite quiet, but as time passed, some birds could occasionally be seen flying in from the surrounding forest and began to gorge themselves on the spirit grass that they had been longing for a long time. It seemed that this great earthquake was not a very bad thing for the birds and animals on Kunlun Mountain. Atsu glanced at the birds that were pecking at a few severed spirit grass nearby, and a look of contempt appeared in its eyes. Then, it barked a few times in that direction, which immediately startled the birds and made them fly up. After a while they landed again and continued to peck. Atsu proudly turned its head and walked into the depths of the grass garden. As it walked, the fragrance in the air suddenly became stronger than before. Atsu seemed to have sensed it and seemed to be a little excited. It looked around and even began to trot. Not long after, a small mound that had just been formed by compression appeared in front of it. Atsu took a big stride and jumped on it. Suddenly, it only felt that everything in front of it was suddenly clear. Below the small mound was a rare piece of flat land that had not been damaged. It was a delightful sight of green grass. Especially in the center of this small piece of green grass, there was a unique spirit grass growing. Its stem and leaves were emerald green, and its head had red branches. There were 9 crystal clear red and purple fruits growing on it. The bursts of fragrance came from this spirit grass. Atsu grinned and its eyes shone. On this day, the situation on Mount Kunlun had basically settled down by the time the afternoon arrived. 100 Herb Hall had also begun to mobilize manpower, including many odd-job disciples, to the flowing fragrance garden to begin rescuing the spiritual herbs. Of course, Lucien was also among them. When he followed the crowd to the grass garden, he was a little speechless when he saw the tragic situation in the herb garden. Then he thought about the value of the damaged spirit grass and thought that this time Bai Tang was going to lose a lot of money. The person who was sent to command this disaster relief was a Jin Dan friar from Bai Tang. His name was Lin Sheng. At first glance he looked like a middle-aged man in his early 40s. This person was very capable and he was able to give commands calmly. He arranged everything in a short time. First, he asked all the handyman disciples who cultivated spirit power to check the damage of the spirit grass in the spiritual fields that they were in charge of. If they could save the spirit grass, they would do so. If they could not, they would report the situation. The other disciples who came along with him, such as the Qi refining and foundation establishment stage, were given priority to repair the formation's high walls and fences, and to drive away the birds and beasts that were still stealing spiritual materials in the spiritual fields to minimize losses. In this way, everyone had something to do. Lucien also walked to his spiritual field, wondering if the red ambergris had escaped the disaster. If it was unlucky and did not escape, he was afraid that Su Qingjun, who valued this spirit grass very much, would be depressed to death. He hurried all the way, bypassing many crooked ridges and many deep pits and mounds that suddenly appeared. Lucien finally arrived at the edge of his spiritual field. At first glance, he saw that the terrain here was flat, and there were many green ginseng grass. Lucien was delighted. But then his expression suddenly changed, and he looked at the center of the spiritual field in astonishment. He took a few steps and saw that in the center of the spiritual field, there was a big pit where the red ambergris had been planted. The red ambergris had disappeared. Lucien was speechless for a moment. Then he frowned and squatted down beside the pit. He first looked at the black soil in the pit. He saw that the soil was fresh and moist as if it had not been dug out for a long time. There were many white thin roots in the soil. Those were the roots of the red ambergris. Many places had been directly torn off. At this time he could still see the milky white medicinal juice slowly seeping out from the thin roots, giving off a strange smell. It's been stolen. Lucien muttered to himself and then looked around. Almost without much effort, he found some suspicious traces on the grass next to him. Those were footprints with black soil stepping on the grass. They were not very conspicuous, but if he looked carefully, he could still see the direction in which they left. They led to a mountain forest outside the fragrance garden. Lucien walked a few steps nearby, and his eyes finally fell on the most distinct footprints at the edge of the pit. Looking at the shape, strength, and size, there seemed to be one of the 4 footprints that was different from the others. It looked much lighter and it looked a little strange. It looked like a person with a lame leg walking. The expression on Lucien's face suddenly became a little strange. He stood up and looked around. Seeing that there seemed to be no one paying attention to this place, he then looked down at the footprints left behind by the herb thief. The more he looked, the more he shook his head. He cursed, "Idiot, if I had known this would happen, I would have killed him and stewed him." With a cold snort, Lucien looked a little annoyed. He turned around and wanted to leave, but after a few steps, he suddenly cursed to himself again. He then turned around and walked to the edge of the pit. Looking around, he coughed and kicked the pile of soil at the side, sweeping a large amount of soil down and covering up most of the marks in the pit. Following that, he walked along the black soil footprints on the ground, and quietly stepped on the side of the footprints. Immediately, black soil could be seen everywhere, covering up the row of strange footprints. After doing this, Lucien shook his head and walked to the front of the garden, preparing to go back and report his losses. At the same time he muttered in a low voice, so low that only he could hear it. I'll eat it when it's fat. I'll eat it when it's fat." Trekking over mountains and rivers, passing through forests and rivers, a black figure ran happily in the mountains of Kunlun after the great earthquake. Atsu held a huge ginseng in its mouth. The ginseng's roots were still sticky with soil, and the top of the ginseng had 9 red fruit ginseng ears. The ginseng fluttered in the mountain wind, like a flag of victory, unhindered. It ran all the way as if it was especially energetic today. Its pair of dog eyes were bright and full of expression, shining as if it was full of hope for the future of its dog life. Running, it saw the Doghead Mountain. It came to the foot of this strange mountain that had once gathered countless celestial birds and auspicious beasts. The strange thing was that on this day, all the animals were gone, and the Doghead Mountain looked a little deserted. Atsu was a little surprised and stopped to look around. It found that all the celestial birds and beasts had indeed left. Only on the top of the Doghead Mountain, there seemed to be a huge body lying there, as if it was sleeping quietly. Atsu suddenly became excited and ran up the mountain. Its slightly lame hind legs made it look a little tired and a little funny, but it didn't care at all and just ran all the way up the Doghead Mountain. Oxen was lying there with its eyes closed. It didn't react to the arrival of Atsu as if it was still sleeping. Atsu carefully walked over, and then slowly put the huge ginseng in its mouth in front of Oxen's bull head. Then it took a step back, looked at Oxen and wagged its tail a few times. Woof, woof woof. Atsu barked a few times at Oxen. Chapter 123. Lu Chen saw Su Qingjun at the entrance of the meadow garden. That day she was wearing a green silk dress and carrying a long sword on her back. She was young and beautiful like a blooming flower in the deep mountains, and people could not help but look at her. Even after the disaster, many people were busy coming and going, but there were still many young male disciples who stole glances at her standing beside Lin Sheng. Every handyman disciple who came in a hurry to report the damage looked like they could not wait to stay in front of her for a moment longer. It was good to be closer to her. However, at this time when everyone had something to do and their feet did not touch the ground, Su Qingjun stood quietly by the side, not talking or working, which seemed a little strange. But it seemed that everyone who passed by thought it was natural, and no one had any objections. Perhaps no one wanted to be nosy, or most people thought that young and beautiful girls were born with special privileges. When it was Lu Chen's turn, he walked in front of Lin Sheng and whispered his name and the location of the spiritual field. Su Qingjun looked over for the first time, and her eyes fell on Lu Chen's face. Lin Sheng flipped through the scroll in his hand and nodded. "You have the red ambergris. What's the situation?" "It's gone," Lu Chen said honestly. "Gone?" Lin Sheng frowned, and Su Qingjun's face also darkened. "Yes, it's gone." Lu Chen repeated himself and said, "When I went over to take a look, the spirit field didn't suffer any damage, but the red ambergris in the field had disappeared without a trace. All that was left was a dug hole." At this point, Lu Chen paused and seemed to ponder for a moment before continuing. "There are a few indistinct footprints of wild beasts in the spirit fields. It's possible that after the earthquake last night destroyed the surrounding high walls and defensive formations, those beasts snuck in and stole them." Lin Sheng snorted, and his face did not look good. He picked up the brush in his hand and drew a line on the scroll. Lu Chen clearly saw that it was on the line of the red ambergris, and he erased it completely. Of course, Lu Chen understood what this action meant, but at the same time, he also saw that there were 5 or 6 similar scratches on the scroll. He couldn't help but be startled and subconsciously said in surprise, "You actually stole so many?" Lin Sheng wanted to say something but stopped. Perhaps he remembered that his identity and the insignificant handyman disciple in front of him were worlds apart, so he did not bother to say more. He just waved his hand and said, "Go to the high wall and help now. Make sure the hole is repaired before dark." Lu Chen nodded and turned to leave. When he walked past Su Qingjun, he stopped and looked at her. Then he shrugged at her, spread his hands and smiled helplessly. Although Su Qingjun looked unhappy, she did not vent her anger on Lu Chen. She just nodded at him and did not say anything. After a moment of silence, she turned and walked away. Lu Chen looked at the pretty figure walking away and shook his head. He then went to the high wall at the edge of the grass garden and was ordered to repair the wall. As he picked up the bricks on the ground, he whispered to himself, "It's so good to be young and beautiful. I don't even have to carry bricks." After dark, people went home one after another, like birds and beasts returning to their nests at dusk. The power of rules in the Kunlun sect, which had existed for 5,000 years, was vividly demonstrated. Even such a sudden earthquake could not change the rules of the Kunlun sect that had been passed down since ancient times. A black shadow sneaked out of the night, limping but agile. It ran all the way to the outside of Lu Chen's house. It first crouched at the door and found that there was light in the house but no one opened the door. Then it sniffed around and went to the back of the house. Sure enough, everyone was busy with other things and no one had the time to repair the house. The small dog hole was still there. The black shadow suddenly became happy and then shrunk its head and rubbed against the inside. Not long after it got in. But before it could heave a sigh of relief, it suddenly felt a gust of wind around it, and then its vision went black. A bag-like thing covered its head, then its entire body, and with a swoosh it was lifted upside down. It heard someone scolding, "How dare you come back, you might as well eat dog stew today." Woof 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 woof. There was a series of whining and angry roars from the cloth bag. It seemed that the black dog was very angry and very angry. Lu Qin, who was standing, was unmoved. He smiled and threw the cloth bag to the ground, then stepped on it twice and said, "You're so capable that you've learned to be a thief." The big cloth bag on the ground twisted and rolled. After a while, Atsu struggled to climb out of it. Then, it barked happily and shook its body vigorously. Suddenly, a cloud of dust was seen flying. "Hey hey hey." Lu Qin waved his hand in the air and said a little angrily, "Stop shaking. Where have you been all day? Why are you covered in dust?" Woof woof. Atsu barked. Lu Qin looked at it and suddenly smiled. He suddenly bent down and reached out his hand, but this time he grabbed Atsu's neck and lifted it up. Atsu struggled in his hand and barked repeatedly. However, just as it was about to show its white fangs to intimidate Lu Qin, it heard Lu Qin say, "Open your mouth again and I'll stew you." Atsu immediately closed his mouth so tightly that not even the slightest gap could be seen, let alone his sharp teeth. Lu Qin snorted and grabbed it to sit on the bed. He pressed the dog's head and stared into its eyes, saying, "Tell me, how many things did you steal from the fragrance garden?" Atsu shook its head repeatedly. It looked determined and righteous. "Where did I put the pot for stew?" Atsu made a prompt decision. It barked and jumped off the bed, wagging its tail at Lu Qin. Then, it stretched out its leg and pointed under the table next to it. Lu Qin looked at the black dog suspiciously. He walked over and pushed the table away. He took a closer look and saw that there was a piece of soil under the table that was originally in the shadow. It was different from the surrounding soil. Lu Qin looked at Atsu. Atsu was sitting next to him, sticking out its tongue and wagging its tail. Its eyes were shining. After thinking for a while, Lu Qin flipped his palm and a black dagger appeared in his hand. He did not care that the sword was covered in dust. He directly stabbed the dagger into the ground. Immediately the soil flew everywhere. Not long after, he dug out a small hole and found a flower stem in the soil. There was a dark yellow flower on it. As soon as this strange dark yellow flower was taken out of the soil, a strange smell spread out. It was difficult to distinguish between the fragrance and the smell. In short, it was an indescribable smell. Lu Qin stared at it for a moment. Then he snorted and said, "Anemone, you have good taste. You won't die from eating it." As he said this, he raised his head and stared at Atsu. He said, "What else?" Atsu shook its head like a rattle drum. "My pot." Woof. Atsu extended its leg and pointed at the bottom of the bed. After working for a while, there were holes everywhere in the small room. Finally, there were a total of 6 kinds of spirit herbs on the table. They lay quietly under the dim candlelight. "Sit down." Lu Qin sat at the table and shouted at Atsu with a stern expression. Atsu ran over and squatted at his feet. It rubbed its head against Lu Qin's leg. Lu Qin was not moved at all. With a cold expression, he pointed at Atsu and said, "Do you know what you did today?" Woof. Atsu's ears perked up and it tilted its head. It looked confused. "Stealing public property at the expense of public interests." Lu Qin looked at the black dog with disdain and said, "I didn't expect you to be such a shameless dog." Woof. Atsu barked again. Lu Qin snorted. His expression eased up a little. At the same time he lowered his voice and said, "Listen, we're on Mount Kunlun. If you're seen or discovered by others stealing spirit herbs, you'll be dead. I won't be able to save you even if I wanted to. Do you understand?" Atsu shrank its head. "Don't do this again." Lu Qin frowned and looked at it sternly. Atsu hesitated for a moment and then nodded. It extended its head and gently rubbed Lu Qin's knee. Lu Qin turned around and looked at the valuable spiritual herbs and spiritual materials on the table. At a glance, almost all of them were at least 2-vein spiritual herbs, and there was even a precious 3-vein spiritual herb. He couldn't help but frown and say, "As for how to deal with these spiritual herbs?" Atsu jumped up and ran towards the door. It then straightened its body and fiddled with the door latch. It looked like it was going to turn in the public property. At the same time, it heard the second half of Lu Chen's sentence. "It's not safe to hide them in this house." Atsu's body stiffened, and then he ran back as if nothing had happened. He wagged his tail at Lu Qin, and his dog eyes shone with the light of a confidant, as if he was telling Lu Qin that great minds think alike. Lu Qin pondered for a moment and said to himself, I'd better put them there. Otherwise, if someone finds out that these spirit herbs are here, we will be in big trouble. Having made up his mind, he pulled the cloth bag on the ground and swept all the spirit herbs on the table into it. Atsu followed beside him, stretching its 2 front legs and lying on the table looking at it eagerly. Lu Qin glanced at it and said, You want to go in too? Okay, come here. Lu Qin waved his hand. Atsu immediately ran over happily and jumped onto Lu Qin's body. Lu Qin smiled, he grabbed the sack tightly and suddenly pressed his hand on his chest. At that moment the world spun, light and shadow blurred. A moment later they had already fallen into that mysterious and ancient tree hole. Lu Qin stood up, poured out the spirit herbs from the cloth bag and identified them one by one. After looking at most of them he put them aside. Only when he got the last spirit herb that was as thick as a baby's arm, white and tender in color, and shaped like a lotus root, he was stunned for a moment and shook his head. Black mud lotus. This thing can't be separated from water. Otherwise the spiritual energy will dissipate in a short time. He glanced at Atsu and said angrily, The pond where this thing was planted is not shallow. How did you dig this thing out? He didn't care about Atsu's reaction. He frowned and thought for a moment. He seemed to be a little hesitant, but in the end he still picked up the black mud lotus and walked to the edge of the puddle in the center of the tree hole. When the black mud lotus sank into the water and fell silently, the ripples spread out, disturbing the reflection of Lu Qin's face. Vaguely, the cluster of black flames in the depths of the water seemed to tremble slightly. After a moment, the black mud lotus fell into the puddle near the cluster of black flames. The water rippled and finally calmed down. Chapter 124. The follow-up measures for the Kunlun mountain earthquake were very effective. Both the mountain and the foot of the mountain quickly settled down. After the initial rescue, all that was left was to count the losses and mend the pen after the sheep was lost. Baichao Tang was one of the Kunlun party's branches that suffered the most losses. Among them, the fragrance garden, where many precious spiritual herbs and spiritual materials were planted in the open air, accounted for most of the losses. In the face of such a natural disaster, those delicate and precious spiritual herbs appeared particularly fragile and could not withstand the devastation of the force at all. The specific number of losses must be very large, but as for how much as a servant disciple, Lu Qin was not qualified to know. However, just by looking at the tense faces of the senior Jinren of Baichao Tang who came and went in the fragrance garden these days, he could roughly guess the number of losses. Therefore these days all the foundation building and qi refining disciples of Baichao Tang were as silent as cicadas in winter. Each and every one of them followed the rules for fear of bumping into those Jinren. On the contrary, the odd job disciples were more relaxed than usual. Firstly, the herb garden had been destroyed, so many people had nothing to do for the time being. Secondly, the disciples who were usually in charge of supervising the herb garden had all been summoned for questioning, so they didn't have time to care about them. Lu Qin felt that these days were pretty good. He got up early in the morning and went out with Atsu. Then the dog went to play by itself and disappeared for a day. He went to the fragrance garden to take a roll call, and the rest was pretty much idle. In the Kunlun party, which had always exploited the servant disciples, such leisurely days were rare. Lu Qin was in a good mood, so he wandered around. Anyway, at this time, there were no small leaders coming to supervise him, so he was very free. As he walked, he greeted and chatted with people along the way. Until he passed by He Changxing's spiritual field, he saw He Changxing sitting in the spiritual field, seemingly dejected. Lu Qin went over to greet him, then asked, "What's wrong with you? Why are you so listless?" He Changxing sighed and said, "The stone garlic I planted is gone." Lu Qin was stunned. He knew a little about stone garlic. This kind of spiritual herb was of the Tuvain grade. It was full of medicinal power and could be used to refine several kinds of panaceas, so it was quite useful. However, its biggest characteristic was that this kind of spiritual herb was very gorgeous when it bloomed. It was said that it also grew overseas. It also had a name that sounded very powerful and awe-inspiring, but it was a little hard to pronounce. Lu Qin did not remember the specific name, but in the vast land of China, the cultivation world of the Middle Earth was just so simple, so it had an unusually down-to-earth name. Lu Qin patted He Changxing's shoulder with a smile and said, "And here I thought it was something serious. It's a natural disaster this time and it's not your fault. Don't worry, you can rest for a few days. When we get back, Bai Chao Tang will naturally arrange for new spiritual herbs. We just need to cultivate them diligently. He Changxing bitterly smiled and shook his head. You can't say it like that. I've already planted the stone garlic very well and was about to harvest it. I'm sure that the rewards I'll get will be great, but now it's all gone. He let out a long sigh and said with a bleak expression, I just want to work hard and rebuild my family's reputation bit by bit. Why is it so difficult? Even God is against me? Lu Chen was also speechless for a while. Looking at He Changxing's depressed and painful expression, he could only pat his shoulder again and casually comfort him before leaving. After he walked for a long distance, he occasionally looked back and saw that ordinary figure still sitting in the spiritual field with his head down. It was as if there was an invisible heavy burden on his shoulders, making He Changxing feel like he could not straighten his back. Life was still going on day by day. Although the natural disaster was terrible, the strength of people was equally tough and powerful. Rules and life were quickly restored. Bai Chao Tang quickly sent people to clean up the damaged spiritual fields, and new spiritual herb seeds or plants were distributed again. The leisurely days of the part-time disciples were over. Occasionally they would look at the distant mountains. The towering Kunlun, deep in the mountains, was a place that was covered by clouds and mist all year round. When the weather was good, they could occasionally see a corner of the 4 strange peaks hanging high in the sky. It was the greatest yearning and dream of all the people who worked hard in the mountains. That must be a fairyland. That must be the most beautiful place in the world. When the sun rose, the clouds and mist were surrounded by fairy air. When the sky darkened, the mist still did not dissipate. The place called between the clouds and sky seemed to be so mysterious and beautiful forever. After midnight, it was the curfew time in the mountains of Kunlun. No one was still walking outside the house, except for the teams of the disciples on night duty who occasionally passed through the mountain paths. However, even the disciples on night duty would not go near the mist in the deepest part of the mountains of Kunlun. That was the most strictly regulated forbidden area in the entire Kunlun party. Among the 4 strange peaks in between the clouds and sky, 2 were occupied by the 2 perfected lords of divinity. The other 2 floating peaks could still allow Jinren Yuanying to set foot on them for cultivation. However, the place below between the clouds and sky, where the mist was thick all year round, was a place that even Jinren Yuanying could not set foot on. This rule was not known by ordinary people, and even if the high-level cultivators knew it, they would not say it. Just like that, it had existed silently in the Kunlun party for thousands of years. Late at night, the moon was bright and the stars were sparse. A full moon hung in the night sky, sprinkling its pure moonlight on the majestic undulating mountains of Kunlun. It illuminated the tall mountain tops, but it still could not shine through the incomparably thick mist. The 4 strange peaks of spring, summer, autumn and winter were suspended in the sky above the mist. They were thousands of feet apart from each other, forming a rare spectacle in the world. Under the moonlight, the mist slowly drifted up and down, like a mysterious and calm sea. No one knew what secrets were hidden under the deep sea. A figure suddenly swept across the sky, like a lonely swan flying in the sky, lightly and freely descending into the mist. When he flew to the edge of the mist, his body suddenly stopped in the air. Under the moonlight, the strong wind in the sky was blowing fiercely, causing his clothes to flutter. It also illuminated his unusually tall and fat body, as well as his shiny bald head, which seemed to be able to reflect the bright moonlight. True Lord Tianlan raised his head and looked at the beautiful bright moon. His eyes were deep and calm, making it impossible to tell what emotions were hidden in them. Then his gaze shifted slightly, looking at one of the 4 majestic and huge shadows high up in the sky. It was the Winter Peak, a world of ice and snow. His gaze seemed to penetrate all the darkness in the world, passing through the layers of obstacles and seeing the distant peak of the Winter Peak, which was surrounded by countless violent storms and snowstorms. For a moment, the depths of his eyes seemed to reflect the distant snowstorm, surging wildly, cold and murderous. After a moment, his huge body suddenly sank, straight into the depths of the mist. The moment he entered the thick mist, a chill immediately surged over, as if it could instantly freeze the blood of ordinary people. However, true Lord Tianlan seemed to turn a blind eye to this, and his whole body continued to descend. Then, thunder suddenly rumbled in the mist, and a few weird electric arcs suddenly lit up and darted over from all directions. However, every time they approached perfected Lord Tianlan, they would suddenly twist in a weird way, painfully turning into all kinds of hideous shapes in midair before disappearing into the mist without a sound. Then, there were restrictions that whistled and surged over like a tide, like demons and ghosts. Countless green gases surged out of the mist, as if they were nether spirits that were about to devour people. In the end, there were even corporeal evil spirits that pounced over viciously. However, all of this seemed to have no effect on true Lord Tianlan. He did not even look straight at them and just descended silently, expressionless as if nothing could stop him. Thus, all the obstructions scattered like smoke, leaving only an unwilling and angry roar behind him, which quickly melted into the dense fog that was as deep as the sea. The mist was so deep that it was unknown when he would reach the bottom, but in front of true Lord Tianlan, everything was like an illusion. About 5 minutes later, the mist in front of true Lord Tianlan suddenly dispersed a little, and a solid ground appeared underground. It was a deep valley, and there was a black disk with a radius of a few feet embedded in the ground. The black disk seemed to be made of iron, stone, and jade. It was unknown what exactly it was made of, but there were all sorts of strange runes carved on it. They were complicated and twisted, but also gave off an ancient and desolate aura, as if it was an extremely ancient object. On the black disk, in the depths of the mist, there was a figure sitting there quietly and alone. True Lord Tianlan descended slowly right in front of that person. The world under the mist was unusually quiet, as if it was isolated from the world, and no sound from the outside world could be heard. There did not seem to be any ordinary mountain breeze here. Not far away from the black disk was a gray mist that was so dense that it seemed corporeal. True Lord Tianlan flicked his sleeves and sat down slowly. Then he raised his head and looked at the person opposite him. In the dim light in this lonely world, the person opposite him looked unusually old and haggard. His body and face seemed to have lost all the luster of life. His wrinkles were deep and his skin was dry and cracked. Even his breathing sounded a little labored. It was a very, very old man. He did not even seem to be half the size of true Lord Tianlan's fat body. He looked as if he had reached the end of his life and was about to die, like the last withered leaf in the cold winter wind and snow. True Lord Tianlan looked at the haggard old man quietly and did not say anything. His eyes flickered slightly as if there were some complicated emotions in them. The haggard old man who had been in meditation with his eyes closed seemed to have woken up from his slumber at this moment. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at Tianlan. His gaze was as bright as the moonlight in the firmaments, as if all his spirit energy and mental strength had been gathered in his eyes. That gaze seemed to be able to see through one's heart and everything in the world. True Lord Tianlan bowed slightly and said calmly, "Long time no see, senior brother." Chapter 125. Everyone knew that there was only one person in the Kunlun party who deserved to be called senior brother by perfected Tianlan. It was Bai Chen, another famous perfected cultivator in the divinity transformation stage of the Kunlun party. According to the genealogy of the Kunlun party, Bai Chen and Tianlan, the two rare geniuses, were both disciples of Elder Tianhong, the founder of the Kunlun party in the past. To be able to teach two perfected cultivators in the divinity transformation stage who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, Elder Tianhong was certainly a great figure himself. It could even be said that the Kunlun party had stepped into the golden age again after Elder Tianhong was born. It had prospered all the way until today, passing on the torch and dominating the West continent, looking down on the vast land of the Divine Land. Now, the famous figures of the past had naturally passed away, and the majestic atmosphere of the magnificent Kunlun did not diminish in the slightest. Naturally, the two perfected cultivators had contributed the most. However, the relationship between Bai Chen and perfected Tianlan had always been rather subtle in the Kunlun party. Hakushin Jinkuan was the eldest disciple of Elder Tianhong. He was a peerless genius who had risen to fame the earliest. His cultivation was profound, and he had been regarded as the pride of the Kunlun party since the very beginning. When Elder Tianhong was still alive, he was already recognized as the natural successor of the leader of the Kunlun party. Perfected Tianlan, on the other hand, was a newcomer who was born 100 years later than Hakushin Jinkuan. Thanks to Elder Tianhong's sharp eyes, he was selected from the mundane world. Then he burst out with shocking talent, and his cultivation level soared. In the end, he became the youngest perfected cultivator in the history of the Kunlun party. These two peerless figures were like the two peerless geniuses of the Kunlun party. They brought honor to their ancestors and made countless Kunlun disciples feel proud of them. They also made the Kunlun party look down on the world and become one of the first-rate cultivation sects in the world. After ancestor Tianhong passed away, Hakushin Jinkuan took over the position of the leader of the Kunlun party. However, from then on, an indescribable secret rumor had been secretly circulating in the Kunlun party. It was said that in Patriarch Tianhong's later years, his favorite disciple wasn't his eldest disciple, Bai Qin, but perfected Lord Tianlan. One of the greatest proof was that Patriarch Tianhong had passed his Taoist name, Tian, to his youngest disciple, Tianlan. Tianlan, Tianlan, Tianlan. This Taoist title was extremely grand, and it was said that Patriarch Tianhong had personally given it to perfected Lord Tianlan. From this, it could be seen that Patriarch Tianhong had high hopes for perfected Lord Tianlan. However, no one knew what the truth was back then and what the person involved was thinking. The truth was that Hakushin Jinkuin took over the position of sect leader and passed it to his disciple, perfected Idol Month, many years later. Perfected Lord Tianlan exerted his strength in the outside world and focused on Zhengxianmeng. He became one of the 6 perfected lords of the Immortal Alliance and was equally famous and prestigious. From another perspective, Bai Chen and Tianlan, the 2 perfected lords, complemented each other from the inside and outside. This allowed the Kunlun party's reputation to rise to a higher level and reach a peak in the past 1,000 years. Bystanders were watching and discussing the twists and turns in this matter, but who could see clearly? Just like how the majestic mountains of Kunlun would not care about the voices of insignificant ants. Under the thick fog, the 2 top figures of the Kunlun party sat opposite each other on a black disk. Not far away from them were layers of gray and murderous fog. Not a single sound could be heard, as if the 2 of them were the only ones left in the world. Hakushin Jinkuin stared at Tianlan. After a while, he slowly said, "It seems like your cultivation has improved again." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "Senior brother's eyes are like a torch. Everything in the world is like dust and has nowhere to run." The corners of Hakushin Jinkuin's mouth twitched slightly. His dry skin seemed to reveal a smile, but the smile seemed a little shaky and ugly because he was too old. Contrasting with his aged voice, it seemed to indicate that this old man who stood at the peak of the cultivation world and had experienced countless years seemed to have reached the end of his life and did not have much time left. "We haven't seen each other for 10 years, right?" Hakushin Jinkuin seemed to be a little emotional. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and said, "That's right. After the battle in the Barren Valley in the Lost Lands, senior brother hated me for killing too much and went into seclusion to cultivate, unwilling to see me." Hakushin Jinkuin looked up at Tianlan. After a while, he suddenly smiled and said, "You're dissatisfied with me, aren't you?" Perfected Lord Tianlan also smiled, his chubby face full of smiles. He said, "Senior brother, you must be joking." Both of them fell silent. No one spoke for a long time. After not seeing each other for 10 years, the 2 of them, who were related to each other, seemed to have nothing to say. It was a little unfamiliar and there was an inexplicable awkward silence. After some time, Hakushin Jinkuin said lightly, "Let's go down." "Yes," perfected Lord Tianlan replied. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the originally silent fog. No one knew where it originated from or where it was going. Wisps of mist swirled up and drifted about, forming strange patterns in the air that gradually formed an ancient and desolate painting. The runes on the black disk revolved around the 2 figures, one fat and one skinny, and lit up one after another. Rays of light seemed to shine from the ancient past into the present, slowly lighting up and emitting a boundless energy. The light shone on the 2 perfected lords' faces and the depths of their eyes that were as deep as the ocean. A thunderous sound rang out from the depths of the ground. The black disk began to spin slowly and the light danced along with it, gradually increasing in speed. Suddenly, there was a sharp whistle and the fog that filled the sky suddenly froze. A moment later, the black disk suddenly descended and went straight into the depths of the ground. Darkness surged over and devoured all the light. Only the gazes of the 2 people seemed to be afraid of even the darkness, not daring to approach. They looked through the shadows of nothingness and stared at each other. The speed at which the stone disk descended became faster and faster. In the air, it even let out a chilling, shrill, piercing sound. The descending passage seemed to be unimaginably deep. After a long time, they still could not see the bottom. It was as if the black disk was going to bring them straight into the deepest part of the ground and rush towards the legendary dark ghost world. Unbeknownst to them, the surrounding atmosphere suddenly became tense. Suddenly, lightning flashed and thunder rumbled in the darkness, striking down from all directions. There were also countless ghosts and ghosts, making all kinds of sinister appearances, roaring and howling as they pounced on them. 2 invisible light shields appeared around the 2 perfected monarchs at the same time, blocking all the restrictions a foot or so away. The only difference was that Hakushin Jinkuin's light shield was as white as snow, while perfected Lord Tianlan's light shield was as red as fire. The rumbling sounds did not stop, and the ghosts and shadows seemed to cover the sky and the earth. The most terrifying scenes in the world seemed to be hidden in the depths of the Kunlun Mountains. But in the eyes of the two perfected lords, it seemed that none of these could shake their Taoist heart. They only looked at each other indifferently and coldly. The flames were cold and murderous, isolating and burning all the ghosts. Gradually, the sudden thunder and roar quieted down. The terrifying phantoms disappeared in the darkness, as if they had finally given up on the fruitless entanglement with the two people. Meanwhile, the black disk was still descending rapidly towards the bottomless underground world. We haven't seen each other for 10 years. Senior brother, your snow wind scripture has improved again. Congratulations. Perfected Lord Tianlan's voice suddenly came from the darkness. I'm just struggling at death's door, Hakushin Jinkuin said lightly, sounding a little tired. When he looked up at his junior brother, there seemed to be a strange light in his eyes. I can't compare to you. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, Senior brother, you're being modest. I still remember when Master was alive he taught me several times. He only said that I was impatient. If I didn't change my nature, I would never be able to achieve great things. He also said that senior brother has a strong will and is a model for my cultivation. I must learn from you. Master. For the first time, there was some change on Hakushin Jinkuin's calm face. Even in the depths of his eyes that seemed to be as cold as snow, there was a faint ripple of wind and snow. Boom. Suddenly, a loud sound came from beneath them. The black disk suddenly shook violently, but it stopped, as if it had finally reached its destination. At some unknown point in time in the seemingly endless darkness, a ray of light shone over. The light came from the front. A huge passage appeared in front of them. The walls were made of ancient and huge rocks, and the huge dome was more than 1,000 feet high. It was like a towering temple that one couldn't see the sky at a glance. It was completely silent, without the slightest bit of vitality. In this mysterious place hidden deep underground, everything seemed to be silent. Bai Chen and Tianlan stood up, looked around and then walked forward side by side. Compared to this terrifyingly large passageway, their figures seemed abnormally small. Even the stone path beneath their feet seemed to be more than 10 times larger than a mortal. The light that shone down from above flickered, as if it had experienced a long period of time. Even time seemed to have frozen here. The sound of their footsteps traveled far and wide. They had been walking for a very long time. Until they saw the end of the huge passage in front of them. The light there dimmed and darkness reappeared. Shadows and shadows flickered, as if they had reached the boundary between light and darkness. There was a door there. It was a tall, huge, majestic and ancient door. The mottled marks of time were left on the door, as if it was quietly waiting for something. The two perfected lords walked over and stopped in front of the huge door. Then they looked up at the same time. The door was like a mountain looking down at them coldly. Darkness surged in from all directions and condensed at the door, pushing the light away. Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly asked Hakushin Jinkuin, "You're awake?" "No." Hakushin Jinkuin shook his head and said, "I turned over." Chapter 126. Standing at the intersection of darkness and light, the two true monarchs' faces seemed to flicker between bright and dark, looking somewhat uncertain. They exchanged a few simple words and then did not speak again. After a while, perfected Lord Tianlan slowly walked forward into the darkness. Looking at his broad back, Hakushin Jinkuin stared silently for a while before following him. Everything was very quiet even when they stood in front of the huge stone door. The darkness was like a tidal wave, like a vast ocean. It seemed to drown the two of them, and they even felt like they were standing in the depths of the ocean. The silence seemed to have reached an extreme. Then an extremely faint voice suddenly floated over from the depths of the darkness. It was illusory, but it also seemed ancient. It was so light and long that it was like a breeze blowing through the darkness. It sounded like thunder rolling through the darkness. Their robes fluttered despite the lack of wind. The voice and the strange breeze quietly passed by, reverberating and fluttering. It gradually became clearer, but it was coming from behind the huge stone door. It was as if a long slumber had occurred. An unimaginable existence in the darkness was breathing peacefully. Perfected Lord Tianlan turned to look at Hakushin Jinkuin. Bai Qin nodded slightly. A moment later Tianlan reached out and pressed his hand on the huge stone door. A deep voice suddenly sounded from beneath the stone door. It sounded like the call of a devil but also like the tremors of the earth. Bit by bit the door slowly opened. Darkness assaulted them. It surged like a raging tide. The strange light barrier lit up around the two of them at the same time. Instantly, lightning flashed and thunder rumbled. It was as if countless terrifying forces had collided with the light barrier at the same time, emitting terrifying screeches. The distorted lightning emitted a bright light that illuminated their faces. One could see their solemn expressions as if they were facing a great enemy. After a while, the lightning slowly calmed down, and the surrounding darkness fell silent. However, behind the stone door, the incomparably deep darkness that seemed to be devoid of any light still existed there quietly. The two of them walked forward into the depths of the darkness. The huge stone door rumbled and slowly closed behind them, shutting off the endless darkness and isolating it from the world. Although 100 Herb Hall had suffered quite a bit of damage in the earthquake, the hall's remedial work was still very effective and swift. About 10 days later, all the potholes and mounds in the flowing fragrance garden, including the damaged high walls and fences, had been completely repaired. The spiritual fields had been tidied up once again. The precious spiritual herbs that had escaped the disaster continued to be carefully nurtured, while the unlucky spiritual herbs that had died or went missing were replanted with new spiritual seeds. Everything seemed to be on the right track again, and the days returned to their former calm and regular routine. It was the same for Lucien. He was given a new spiritual plant and started to cultivate it diligently like before. He Changxing and the other Chore's disciples were in a similar situation. However, this peace didn't last long. About 20 days after the Kunlun earthquake, a piece of news suddenly came out and spread throughout the Kunlun party in an instant. Even Kunwa City at the foot of the mountain was stirred up in the blink of an eye. Su Qingjun, a disciple of the Kunlun party's Masato Kihara, successfully advanced to the Jin Dan realm and became the youngest Jin Dan friar in the history of the Kunlun party. A mere 22-year-old Jin Dan friar. His future prospects were so great that it was simply unimaginable. Even the two lofty deity transformation stage sovereigns hadn't reached this level of talent and speed. Although there was still a world of difference between the Jin Dan realm and the deity transformation stage sovereigns, and there was still a long and endless road to walk, and although since ancient times, there were countless unimaginable geniuses who fell halfway on this road and sighed at the sight of the sovereign position, there was always hope, wasn't there? There was a lot of hope, wasn't there? Kunwa City was in an uproar. The Su family was in an uproar. In a short period of time, there were countless wedding invitations, and the people who came to congratulate them broke the threshold. Even the servants of the Su family went out with their chests puffed out, as if they had more confidence. As for Kunlun, it was, after all, a famous cultivation sect, so it was somewhat different from the secular world, so there wasn't such an exaggerated scene. However, it was said that on that day Masato Kihara was so ecstatic that he got drunk, which was rare in recent years, and his loud laughter spread far and wide. The elders of the older generation sighed with relief or some other emotions, while the younger generation of Kunlun disciples were basically in awe and admiration. For a moment, Su Qingjun became the most popular figure in the Kunlun party, and she also became the topic of discussion for countless people after their meals. Among them, the most discussed topic was whether this young woman could become a new generation of deity transformation stage sovereigns in the future. Just thinking about it was enough to stir one's heart. In Liuxiang Garden, Su Qingjun also became the center of everyone's topic. When Lu Qin accidentally heard his companions talking about this matter, he recalled Su Qingjun's appearance a few days ago, and he secretly sighed with emotion in his heart. That red ambergris ginseng seemed to be very important to her advancement, but unfortunately, it was lost in an accident. But even so, Su Qingjun still succeeded in breaking through. This kind of genius with great luck was really too different from ordinary people. When Lu Qin saw Su Qingjun again, it was already several days later. That day, as usual, he was working in the Liuxiang Garden's grass garden when he suddenly heard a noise in the distance. It seemed like there was a dispute and someone was making a ruckus over there. This was a rare thing. Usually, the handyman disciples worked honestly. Occasionally they would slack off in their spare time, but they never dared to make a ruckus in public like this. It should be known that the people in charge of this area were all 100 Herb Hall's Taoists. Whether it was prestige, cultivation, or strength, not one of them wasn't a high and mighty figure. If they didn't like him, it would be too easy for them to take care of an odd job disciple. This was strange, and after the ruckus started, it did not subside. Instead, the noise became louder and louder. It seemed that the quarreling got angry and did not care anymore. This alerted even more people. Many of the odd job disciples and direct disciples who were passing by saw this scene and walked over to spectate. Lucian was also curious, so he walked over. When he got closer to take a look, he was suddenly startled. He saw that the quarreling parties were not the handyman disciples working in the Liuxiang garden, but 3 people on one side and 5 personal disciples on the other. It seemed like they were all cultivators in the qi refining realm. But beside them, there was a handyman disciple either lying down or kneeling on the ground. Among them, the kneeling handyman disciple's face was swollen red, his body was trembling, and his face was filled with humiliation. It was He Changxing. The surrounding people were discussing spiritedly. There were already people who recognized the two sides. In addition to the words of cursing, it didn't take long for Lu Qin to roughly understand what was going on. The Kunlun disciples who were quarreling on both sides were all children of influential families in Kunwu City. On one side of the trio was the Su family of Kunwu City. All 3 of them had already reached the peak of the qi refining realm when they were in their teens. They were young and had good innate talents. Even if they could not be compared to Su Qingjun, that kind of peerless genius, they were the rising stars of the younger generation that the Su family highly valued and had high hopes for. They had the title of Su family's 3 heroes. As for the 5 people on the other side, they belonged to 3 influential clans: Lin clan, Lu clan, and Qin clan. These 3 influential clans possessed extraordinary strength in Kunwu City. They had known each other since childhood and could be considered good friends. As for today's matter, it was actually a young man from the 3 heroes of the Su family, Sumo. He learned from his talented older sister Su Qingjuan's method. Some time ago, he also left a precious 2-striped spiritual plant in the flowing fragrance garden and asked Bai Chao Tang to plant it on his behalf. Coincidentally, among the 5 people on the other side, there was also a young man from Lin family who placed the same kind of spiritual plant in the garden and then asked someone to plant it. That person just happened to be He Changxing. That spiritual plant was Lycoris. Planting the same kind of spiritual plant on both sides wasn't a big deal, but after the great earthquake in Kunlun, He Changxing's Lycoris, which was originally planted very well, suddenly disappeared. This kind of encounter happened many times in the flowing fragrance garden. Most people thought it was because the high walls collapsed and the formation failed, causing wild beasts in the forest to sneak in and steal, so they couldn't do anything about it. He Changxing's heart ached endlessly because of the reward he was about to receive, and that young man from Lin family could only accept his bad luck. But on this morning, when He Changxing inadvertently walked past the spiritual field planted by that young man from Su family, he discovered that the Lycoris in the spiritual field were a bit abnormal. To be exact, they were growing too well. The odd-job disciple who planted the Lycoris for Sumo was called Zhang Ji. His talent was slightly worse than He Changxing's, and he wasn't as diligent as He Changxing, so the Lycoris he planted were never as good as He Changxing's. But on this day, when He Changxing saw the Lycoris in his field, he found that it was almost exactly the same as the one he had planted before. He Changxing immediately made a fuss. Of course, Zhang Ji denied it, and at the same time he spoke sarcastically. He Changxing was extremely angry and fought with him. After the news spread, very soon, Sumo and the others, as well as the young disciple from Lin family named Lin Kuangyi, all rushed over. After hearing the news, Lin Kuangyi knocked Zhang Ji over with one palm, pointing out that the Lycoris was his. How could the Sumo agree? Both sides immediately quarreled, and in the chaos He Changxing was also kicked over and ordered to kneel on the ground. Lu Qin looked at He Changxing, who was kneeling on the ridge of the field from afar. Looking at his lowered head and his flushed face, Lu Qin was silent for a moment. The 2 young men in the field were all from aristocratic families and had been spoiled since they were young. In addition, they were young and vigorous, so the quarrel became louder and louder. The more they quarreled, the angrier they became. In the end, they actually started to fight. This time it was a complete mess. Although these disciples were not very strong, they were still much stronger than ordinary people. For a moment, everyone retreated. Not long after, the situation tilted in the favor of the Lin family. After all, the 3 heroes of the Su family had fewer people. After a moment, Sumo, who was the leader, shouted angrily, "Call my sister here, call my sister here." Someone at the side shouted loudly, "I've already called her, young master, don't worry." Lin Kuangyi and the others were furious. They looked back but found that the crowd was in a mess. How could they find out who was shouting? So they continued to shout, and the 2 sides were in a mess. Lu Qin stood at the edge of the crowd. Suddenly he felt a faint cold wind behind him. He looked back and saw that woman standing behind him. Her eyes were as calm as autumn water, bright and clear. She glanced at his face and stopped for a moment. "It's you?" she said. "Luchin." Luchin answered. "Oh." She nodded and said, "I remember." Chapter 127. Luchin smiled and said, "Senior Marshal Sister, you have a good memory." Su Qingjun glanced at him. She didn't feel shy, but she seemed a bit embarrassed that she forgot the name of the person in front of her. At the same time, a series of shouts came from behind the crowd. Luchin coughed. For some reason he recalled He Changxing's humiliated appearance just now. He originally wanted to step aside, but he stopped and smiled at Su Qingjun. "Right, I forgot to congratulate Senior Marshal Sister for advancing your cultivation and attaining the Jindan Great Path." Su Qingjun nodded with an indifferent expression. It seemed she had heard such words too many times recently and was numb to it. However, the shouts in front of her piqued her interest. She glanced in that direction. At this time Luchin said, "I'm ashamed to say this. Back then you said that the red ambergris ginseng would be very useful for breaking the realm, so I also carefully cultivated it. Unfortunately, that kind of accident happened. I'm really sorry." Su Qingjun was startled for a moment, then she shook her head and said, "This can't be blamed on you. The earthquake is a natural disaster, and the wild beasts can't help but steal it. It's the will of the heavens." Luchin thought that the black dog was nothing but a fart of heaven's will. However, at this moment, he had the intention of delaying it so that the youngsters of the Su clan could be taught a lesson. He revealed a guilty expression and sighed, saying, "Even so. Sai, let's not talk about it. Fortunately, Shiji Su, your talent is outstanding. Even without the red ambergris ginseng, you were still able to break through to the Jindan realm. Congratulations." Su Qingjun said, "No, I still used the red ambergris ginseng." Luchin was stunned. "What? But the red ambergris ginseng is gone, you?" Su Qingjun said, "Oh, that's just a small matter. Although the red ambergris ginseng is precious and rare, it's not to the point of being unique. Before I broke through, I sent someone to the biggest shop in Kunwa City and bought 2 stalks. Their age and medicinal effects are better than the previous one." "How much?" 22,000 spirit stones. Luchin stared fixedly at Su Qingjun. He saw that her expression was calm, as if this was only natural. After a while he smiled bitterly and nodded. "Congratulations, congratulations." Su Qingjun politely nodded to him and said, "Thank you." Luchin took a step back and stood to the side, allowing Su Qingjun to walk past. Then he looked into the distance, but all he could see were the mountains rising and falling, the sky high and the earth high. After a while, he suddenly cursed in a low voice. F***ck them. As Su Qingjun walked into the crowd, the first person to approach her suddenly became silent. Then, he consciously moved to the side and looked at her with a strange gaze. Soon, more and more people became aware of it. The originally noisy crowd quickly quieted down, and the path also moved faster and faster, allowing Su Qingjun to walk in. Bang! Sumo staggered backward and fell to the ground. She rolled twice and just happened to lie down in front of a pair of beautiful and slender feet. At this moment, one of his eyes was black and one side of his face was swollen. He looked like he had just been beaten. Sumo seemed to be a bit dizzy from the beating. He staggered and raised his head. After a while, he saw the beautiful face in front of him clearly. He was stunned for a moment before he suddenly shouted, big sister, quickly come and save me." There was a commotion in the crowd. Someone said in a low voice, "She actually came." Su Qingjun frowned and looked at Sumo's face with a slightly gloomy expression. The few people who were still fighting at the side also stopped in shock and quickly separated. Just now, in the fight between the two sides, although everyone was Qi refining disciples and their cultivation was not much different, Lin Kuangyi's side had 5 people while the Su family only had 3. In the end they still suffered a loss. The other 2, Su Qian and Su Wen, were also swollen. It seemed like the 3 heroes of the Su family were more like the 3 bears of the Su family. And Lin Kuangyi's side of 5 people saw Su Qingjun suddenly appear. For a moment, they also felt a bit guilty and did not dare to be arrogant. As for Zhang Ji, who was lying on the ground, and He Changxing, who was still kneeling on the ground, no one paid any attention to them. "What happened?" Su Qingjun asked Sumo. Among the 3 bears of the Su family, Sumo was her biological younger brother. Su Qian and Su Wen were considered cousins in terms of seniority, and their bloodlines were also extremely close. So seeing the 3 like this, Su Qingjun was not happy in her heart. However, she had always been educated and knew etiquette, so she first asked about the cause of the matter. Big sister, it was that Lin guy who bullied people. Sumo shouted and began to blame Lin Kuangyi's group with her saliva flying everywhere. On the side, Su Qian and Su Wen also hurried over to help and told the story from beginning to end. On the other side, Lin Kuangyi's group became angry and couldn't help but open their mouths to argue. Both sides quarreled, and it looked like there was anger rising again. After a while, suddenly Su Qingjun lightly shouted, "Shut up!" The three Su family brothers immediately shut up. On the other side, Lin Kuangyi's group looked at each other and also quieted down. Su Qingjun glanced at the stone garlic in the spiritual field and saw that the spiritual plant was indeed very beautiful. After a moment of silence, she looked at Lin Kuangyi and didn't say much. She only asked, "Do you have proof?" Lin Kuangyi's group of 5 looked at each other in dismay and were momentarily speechless. In this quarrel, everyone took advantage of the chaos to fight. Young people were fooling around and no one cared. Whoever had the bigger fist was the one in the right. But if they really started to reason, these young people from aristocratic families weren't really stupid. How could they not know that there were some things that didn't make sense? That stone garlic was planted by me. I know, I recognize it. Suddenly a voice shouted. Everyone was startled and looked over. They saw that it was He Changxing, who was kneeling on the ground, shouting loudly with his neck straight. The faces of Sumo's group darkened and they glared at He Changxing. On the other side, Lin Kuangyi's group was overjoyed. They didn't care so much and started to make a ruckus. They repeatedly said, that's right, that's right. He was the one who planted the stone garlic. Other than him, no one else can recognize that spiritual plant. That's right. In this grass garden, this person is the best at planting stone garlic. If he says there's a problem, then there must be a problem. All kinds of discussions surged. Su Qingjun slightly frowned and glanced at He Changxing. And behind the crowd, Lu Chen also looked over from afar. He didn't say anything and only shook his head slightly. You mean that stone garlic is the one you originally planted? As soon as Su Qingjun said this, the surroundings became quiet. Even Lin Kuangyi's group didn't say anything. This kind of quiet atmosphere made He Changxing a little nervous. At the same time, he looked at Su Qingjun's exceptionally beautiful face. His breathing seemed to become a little hurried. After a while, he finally said, "Yes, I planted it." "Do you have proof?" Su Qingjun asked. He Changxing was startled and loudly said, "That was planted by me. I recognize it, I recognize it." The surrounding crowd was silent. At this moment, many people seemed to have thought of something but no one spoke. Su Qingjun shook her head. Her tone was still calm, but the meaning in her words was very clear. This won't do. You need proof. You can't say that something is yours and then it must be yours, right? She pondered for a moment and said, material evidence or witness is fine. You can choose any one. As long as it makes sense, I will let second brother return the stone garlic to you. As she said this, she looked at Lin Kuangyi and said, Junior brother Lin, do you think it's okay for me to deal with it like this? Lin Kuangyi smiled bitterly and said, okay. With Jean Dan Friar standing there and one with a bright future, he dared to say no. Moreover, Su Qingjuan's words from the beginning to the end were reasonable. He couldn't say anything more. Proof? When everyone's eyes focused on He Changxing's face, he was confused and murmured, material evidence. Witness? This, but it was really planted by me. The crowd was silent. The Su family was looking at him. The Lin family was looking at him. Everyone was looking at him. It was as if the heavens and earth were looking at him. He knelt in the crowd, but it was as if he was outside of the cold world. After a long time, Su Qingjun didn't say anything. Instead, Sumo, who was standing beside her, sneered and said, Hey, that guy, do you have proof or not? Quickly say it. He Changxing's face turned red. He stammered, material evidence? Where is the material evidence? You don't believe my words? Witness, yes, witness. He suddenly jumped up, looking wild with joy. He loudly said, When I planted the stone garlic, many people saw it. You, right? You all saw me planting the stone garlic, right? Didn't I plant it very well? Didn't I plant the best stone garlic in the fragrance garden? What do you think? There was a slight commotion in the crowd, but it quickly quieted down. No one spoke and no one whispered. When he pointed at others, especially the odd-job disciples with the same status as him, those people quietly avoided him or remained silent. He Changxing was stunned. His face was ashen as if he couldn't believe his eyes. But at this moment, his eyes suddenly lit up as if he saw something. After a moment of hesitation, he suddenly shouted and rushed over. The crowd moved aside. Su Qingjun and the others also looked at his actions. He Changxing rushed into the crowd and stopped in front of Lu Chen, whose face had changed slightly. Then they saw him laughing loudly. He grabbed Lu Chen's hand and dragged him into the field. Then he hugged Lu Chen's hand tightly and looked at Lu Chen with eyes full of expectation. With a slightly trembling voice as if he was entrusting his life's hope, he said, "Lu Chen, you are the best friend of mine and we talk the most. Tell me you can testify for me. That stone garlic, is it mine or not?" In a moment, everyone's eyes fell on Lu Chen, including Su Qingjun, who also looked at him with a slightly surprised expression. Beside her, the 3 brothers of the Su family and the 5 people of the Lin family also looked at this lowly odd-job disciple with complicated expressions. Lu Chen expressionlessly looked around and then turned his head, quietly looking at He Changxing. That man was looking at him with eyes full of gratitude and hope, as if he was grasping at a life-saving straw. He tried his best to show a trace of a smile and then softly said, "Lu Chen, help me, tell me." Chapter 128. The cold mountain breeze blew from afar, ruffling people's clothes, making them feel a trace of coldness. 2 figures slowly walked over from afar, one old and one young with white hair and black hair. The old one was Melaleuca japonica, and the young girl was Exn. They looked over from afar. Melaleuca japonica frowned and instructed Exn. Exn nodded and walked over. In the crowd, under everyone's gaze, Lu Chen did not speak for a while. He Changxing urged him, "Lu Chen, say it. Didn't you come to my place many times before? Didn't you always see the stone garlic I planted?" At this time, Su Qingjun suddenly took a step forward, looked at Lu Chen and said, "Lu Chen, do you really know this person?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment, nodded and said, "Yes, his name is He Changxing. Like me, he is a part-time disciple who joined the sect this year. I know him." Su Qingjun looked back at Sumo, who was beside her. Sumo smiled at her sister, but there seemed to be a trace of reluctance in her smile. Su Qingjun's eyes glimmered. It was as if a gust of wind had blown across the surface of a calm lake, causing some ripples to appear. After a moment, she turned back to look at Lu Chen and said calmly, "You and I have not known each other for long, but when you helped me cultivate the red ambergris, you should also be a trustworthy person. Say it, if you can really prove that it is him, I will believe you." Lu Chen's gaze was slightly lowered, and the corner of his mouth slightly pursed. He seemed to be smiling but not smiling and seemed to be angry but not angry. It was unknown what exactly he was feeling at this moment. At the same time, the surrounding crowd was in an uproar. When they looked at Lu Chen again, their gazes were different. Yi Changxing was overjoyed. Grinning from ear to ear, he grabbed Lu Chen's arm and shouted, "Tell me, that's my stone garlic." Lu Chen narrowed his eyes. After a moment, he raised his head and looked forward. Ignoring He Changxing, he looked at Su Qingjun indifferently, then looked at Sumo and the other 2 beside her, as well as Lin Kuangyi and the others on the other side and said, "What do you want me to say?" "Just ask." Su Qingjun pondered for a moment before asking, "Among the odd-job disciples in the flowing fragrance garden, is this person the best at growing stone garlic?" "Yes." Lu Chen replied straightforwardly. Yi Changxing laughed heartily. Su Qingjun frowned slightly, then nodded, while the Su and Lin people on the other side had different expressions. But very quickly, Su Qian of the 3 Su family suddenly took a step forward and said, "Can I ask you a few words?" Lu Chen said, "Of course you can, please ask." Su Qian glanced at He Changxing, who was standing beside Lu Chen, and said, "Since you are familiar with He Changxing, do you know this Zhang Ji?" As he said this, he pointed at the odd-job disciple who was still unconscious on the ground. Lu Chen said, "I know him, but I don't usually interact with him, so I am not familiar with him." Su Qian's eyes lit up. "You are not familiar with Zhang Ji?" "Not familiar. That is to say, you rarely come to Zhang Ji's land." "Almost never." Su Qian clapped his hands and said, "Then have you seen the stone garlic that Zhang Ji planted?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment. After a while, he said indifferently, "I don't have any impression of it. I should have never paid attention to it." Su Qian laughed, looked around, and then said with a slightly complacent expression, "Then let me ask you one last time. Are you absolutely certain that this stone garlic in front of you is not the one that Zhang Ji planted himself?" Lu Chen was silent again. This time, everyone around him seemed to hold their breath. He Changxing was a little nervous, staring closely at Lu Qin. Lu Qin lowered his eyes as if he was carefully thinking, but also as if he was comparing in his heart. After a while, he raised his head, looked at everyone in front of him and then said expressionlessly, "No, I can't be sure." Boom. The surrounding crowd suddenly seemed to explode, the sound waves rolling over. Everyone showed all kinds of different expressions. And in the field, Lin Kuangyi and the others looked at each other, revealing a bitter smile as if they had already expected this result. And the three Su family brothers were happy. Only Su Qingjuan's face seemed to show a subtle and strange expression, looking deeply at Lu Qin. "You!" A hoarse shout with disbelief and anger came from beside Lu Qin. Suddenly, a pair of hands rushed over and fiercely pushed Lu Qin, causing him to stagger back a few steps and fall to the ground. It was He Changxing. His face looked a little twisted, his eyes bloodshot. He looked fiercely at Lu Qin as if the last hope in his life had been shattered by Lu Qin. "You are not human." He roared and shouted at Lu Qin, "How dare you say that? You clearly know that the stone garlic is mine." Lu Qin silently stood up, looking at He Changxing. That gaze was as indifferent as the mountain wind blowing, almost without any emotion, no fear, no sympathy. Deep in his eyes, the gaze was as deep as the sea, reflecting only a silent darkness. "I am just speaking the truth," Lu Qin said indifferently. "What truth? What you said is bullshit." He Changxing was still shouting. He seemed to have lost control, his emotions were collapsing, even tears were flowing down his face, pointing at Lu Qin then pointing at everyone around, roaring, "You are all like this, you don't believe me, obviously I am a good person." He screamed loudly, suddenly turned around and ran away, rushing out of the crowd, disappearing in the blink of an eye. When he had just rushed out, the Su family brothers seemed unwilling to let him go, wanting to stop him, but Su Qingjun coldly glanced at them, in addition to He Changxing's frenzied expression, like a madman, so the Su family brothers gave up. At the side, Lin Kuangyi and a few others discussed in low voices. Then he walked to Su Qingjuan's side and smiled apologetically. "Senior Sister Su, we were indeed in the wrong today. It's all our fault for trusting that bastard and causing a misunderstanding with Brother Su and the others. Later I will definitely apologize, there's no need." Su Qingjun suddenly interrupted him. "Let's end this matter here." Lin Kuangyi was a bit surprised, but then his face lit up with joy. He said with a smile, "That's great, thank you Shiji Su." Su Qingjun glanced at him and said indifferently, "Junior Marshal Brother Lin, Su family and Lin family aren't enemies, on the contrary, our two families have been friends for several generations. If today's matter were to be spread back to Kunwa City, I don't need to say anything, I'm afraid Uncle Lin won't be happy. Have you thought about this?" Lin Kuangyi was startled, his face turned pale and he hastily said, Yes, what Shiji Su said is right, little brother was wrong. In the future, if Shiji Su needs little brother's help, just tell me, little brother will be honored to be able to help you." Su Qingjun sighed and said, "Forget it, you can go." Lin Kuangyi and the others repeatedly agreed. They didn't dare to stay here for long, so they hastily left. Su Qingjun looked back at Lu Qin, who was still standing there. She wanted to say something, but she hesitated. A trace of apology flashed across her eyes, but in the end she didn't say anything. She just slightly nodded at him, then called out to Sumo and the others and left. On the prairie, the crowd of onlookers also began to gradually disperse, but He Changxing's crazy appearance just now was still deeply imprinted in their hearts. Soon only Lu Qin was left in the crowd. He stood there silently for a moment, and just when he was about to leave, he suddenly saw a young girl standing not far from him. It was Exian. She looked around and saw that there was no one around, so she hastily ran over, gently pulled Lu Chen's arm and said in a low voice, "Brother Lu, don't be angry, I saw everything just now, those people. I'm fine." Lu Chen interrupted her words and smiled. Exn blinked and said, "Really?" Lu Chen looked at the young girl in front of him with a smile, looking at her beautiful face under her soft long hair, and his gentle eyes hid a trace of concern. "I'm fine, really?" he said softly. "Okay." Exn immediately became happy, then pointed to the front and said, "Marshal Uncle Yen is still waiting for me there, I'll go first." Lu Chen smiled and nodded and said, "Okay, you go." Exn smiled and turned to leave, the mountain wind blowing up the corner of her clothes, like a flower fluttering in the world. This matter quickly passed. Some people took it as a bolt from the blue, thinking that the sky had broken, while others thought that it was just a small matter like the waves of the river and the sea. From that day on, He Changxing and Lu Qin became enemies. When they occasionally met on the road, he would stare at Lu Qin with an extremely resentful look, as if he wanted to kill Lu Qin with his eyes. Of course, Lu Qin clearly felt this blatant hatred, but he felt a little bored and a little funny. Of course, he didn't show it on the surface. Most of the time, he just passed by He Changxing indifferently and expressionlessly. A few days later, somehow, this matter was suddenly known by the people in charge of Baichao Tang. It was said that a big shot couldn't stand it after knowing it, and told the people in charge of Baichao Tang. As a result, Baichao Tang suddenly became angry. The three brothers of the Su family, Lin Kuangyi and the other four, were all fine, but only the handyman disciples were punished. He Changxing, Zhang Ji and Lu Qin were called to the supervisor, and they were scolded heavily. In the end, regardless of the twists and turns, Zhang Ji and He Changxing were the cause of the trouble, and 20 spiritual stones were deducted directly. Lu Qin was only caught to testify, so he was not to be blamed. So, the fine was waived and he was released after a scolding. From then on, He Changxing seemed to become more and more abnormal. Every day he would ramble on and on. Some people even saw him sharpening a sharp blade and carrying it with him. It was as if he was about to go crazy. And according to people living near him these days, He Changxing said the most, "I'll kill you, I'll kill you." Chapter 129. This morning Lu Qin took Atsu out. As usual, in order to ensure the safety of all kinds of precious herbs in the herb garden, no birds or beasts were allowed to enter the garden. Therefore Atsu never went there with Lu Qin. Basically, they parted ways as soon as they left the garden. Lu Qin went to the herb garden to work, while Atsu ran out to play for a day. It took care of its own food and drinks and only came back when it was dark. This method of letting go was, of course, less troublesome for Lu Qin, but Xian often nagged about it. She was always worried that something would happen to Atsu when it wandered outside alone. However, Lu Qin did not care about her worry and ignored it. Atsu seemed to like this kind of life very much. It ran out to play all day and seemed to be very comfortable and happy. Therefore, in the end, Xian could only accept this fact. At most, when she occasionally came to visit Atsu, she would secretly bring it some of its favorite meat bones. At the door of the house, Atsu turned around and called out to Lu Qin as a greeting. Then it ran away like a wisp of smoke. No one knew where it went to play today. Recently, Atsu seemed to like to go out, but no one knew where it went. Lu Qin was too lazy to care about it and walked all the way to the fragrance garden. After entering the herb garden and coming to the spiritual field, Lu Qin began his day's work in the breeze with a fragrant smell. However, this day did not seem to be lonely, because he had only worked for a while when Xian appeared with a smile on her face beside his spiritual field. She waved at him and said with a smile, "Brother Lu, good morning." Lu Qin patted the soil on his hands, walked to the edge of the field and sat down. He smiled at Xian and said, "I say you are too idle. I only see you wandering around all day." Xian glared at him and said, "What do you mean?" Lu Qin said, "I remember you are at the Rock Mountain. Why do I see you at the fragrance garden every day these days? Aren't you slacking off?" Xian chuckled and revealed a proud expression. She said, "You don't understand. Marshal Aunt Yen Luo has recently been transferred to Flowing Fragrance Garden to manage things here. She brought me here too." "Oh, no wonder." Lu Qin nodded and said with a smile, "It seems that Marshal Aunt Yen likes you very much." "Of course, who doesn't like this lady?" Xian playfully stuck out her tongue. Just as she was about to say something, her expression suddenly froze. The joke she was about to say was stuck in her mouth. Her eyes looked behind Lu Qin as if she had seen something surprising. For a moment she couldn't say anything. Lu Qin was slightly surprised and turned his head to look. He frowned slightly. He saw that a few dozen feet behind him He Changxing was walking past. His pace was not fast, but his eyes were fiercely staring in Lu Qin's direction. Perhaps because he did not sleep well last night, He Changxing's eyes were a little bloodshot. His gaze was full of resentment. He looked at Lu Qin as if he had seen his father's murderer or his mortal enemy. He could only be described as gnashing his teeth. Xian couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine when he occasionally glanced at the people around Lu Qin with a look of disgust and hatred. Lu Qin stood up expressionlessly and took a step forward to stand in front of Xian, blocking He Changxing's gaze for her. At the same time he stared coldly into He Changxing's eyes. His gaze met He Changxing's without the slightest intention of backing down. He Changxing seemed to become more and more angry when Lu Qin looked at him like this. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and his face revealed an indescribable anger. It was as if he could not believe that Lu Qin dared to look him in the eye without the slightest bit of guilt or shame. But Lu Qin just stood there calmly, silently looking straight at him with a bit of coldness. After a while He Changxing turned around and strode away. "Brother Lu, this person, how can this person be like this?" EXN poked her head out from behind Lu Qin. Looking at He Changxing's back, there was still some lingering fear in her heart as she asked Lu Qin. Lu Qin shook his head and said, "It's probably because he hates me." EXN was startled for a moment and said, "Is it because of the fight over the stone garlic that day?" "Yes." "How can that matter be blamed on you?" EXN shouted. Looking at her pretty face, it seemed that it was somewhat pale from anger. She said, "That stone garlic was Sumo's. The ones who beat him and humiliated him were also the people of the Su family. The one who insisted on standing up was him. Even if we take a step back, it was Lin Kuangyi who forced him." Su Qingjuan's sister Su stood up and said a few words. What she wanted was proof, but he couldn't produce it. Everyone stood up and spoke. "So why does he only hate you?" "Yes, why does he hate me the most?" Lu Qin said to himself. After a while he turned to look at EXN. He saw that the girl's chest was still heaving up and down. It seemed that she was not light. He couldn't help but feel a little warmth in his heart. "All right, sit down." Lu Qin smiled and pulled her arm. He said with a smile, "I'm not even this flustered and exasperated. Why are you so angry?" "No, this doesn't make sense. I just feel wronged for Brother Lu." EXN pouted and complained. Lu Qin looked up at the sky. There were a few white clouds floating in the blue sky. After a while, he said to EXN, "Actually, I told you the reason." "Oh, what is it?" EXN was startled. "It's because I'm weak," Lu Qin said faintly. "Su Qingjun is a peerless genius. There's a world of difference between her and mortals. She's not someone he can have delusions about." The three brothers, Sumo, Su Qian and Su Wen, are from the Su family. Their influence is enormous. In addition, Su Qingjun has just advanced to the Jindan realm. He Changxing is courting death by provoking them. Lin Kuangyi and the others are also in a similar situation. Even if the Lin family and the Qin family can't compare to the Su family, it's really too easy for them to crush a part-time disciple like him. Lu Qin looked at EXN and said calmly, "He Changxing's ancestors were from an aristocratic family in Kunwu City. I'm afraid he knows a thing or two about these things. So, even if he hates them, he doesn't dare to provoke them." EXN clenched her teeth and looked at Lu Qin. She said, So, no matter how you look at it, I'm still the weakest. We're all part-time disciples and I don't have any aristocratic family background. Isn't it the safest and cheapest way to vent his anger on me?" Lu Qin smiled and said, "Everyone sees him acting like he's crazy now. In fact, that person's heart is very clear." "Shameless." EXN spat. Her face was full of anger. She said huffily, "If you have the ability, then go find the main culprit. I saw it clearly that day. He deliberately pulled you to testify for him. In the end, you didn't help him by telling the truth, so he actually hates you? If he really dares to go find those people from the Su family, I might think a bit more highly of him. He's really a coward." Lu Qin sat quietly for a while, then said, "In fact, I also didn't expect him to be this kind of person. These days, the weak are already so cowardly that they don't dare to threaten the strong. So, they only dare to pile their hatred on the weak, thinking they can vent their anger in this way. They think they can become valiant in this way. Don't you think it's ridiculous? It's really disgusting." EXN frowned and said with a face full of disgust. Then she shook her head and sighed, saying, "Brother Lu, why do I feel that, ever since I met you, I've always heard these not so good things? The more I hear, the more I feel that the world is always dark and there's no light at all." Lu Qin laughed and couldn't help but pat EXN's head. He said with a smile, "That's because you haven't seen these things since you were young. I told you to broaden your horizons, but you actually don't want to." EXN covered her head and hit Lu Qin's arm. She complained, "Don't pat my head, I've become stupid." It's not that I don't want to, it's just that I feel uncomfortable listening to it." Lu Qin looked at her deeply, which made EXN feel a little unnatural. She said, "Brother Lu, why are you looking at me like that?" Lu Qin thought for a moment and said, "Actually, although there are many bad things in this world, I used to think that the whole world is that dark you mentioned. But after so many years, I don't think it's like that. There are still some very good things in this world." EXN's eyes lit up. She said, "What are they?" Lu Qin looked at her and said with a smile, For example, when you smile, you're very beautiful. It's like the sun is shining on you. Yexan was stunned for a moment. After a moment, her cheeks suddenly flushed red. She jumped up and stammered, What did you say? Lu Qin said with a smile, Can't I say you're beautiful? No one knew what Yexan muttered, but she suddenly stamped her feet. She looked at Lu Qin with a mixture of joy and anger, then she turned around and ran away. Lu Qin shook his head with a smile. He got up and returned to the spiritual fields, ready to continue working. But before he could bend down, he suddenly heard the sound of hurried footsteps. He looked up and saw that it was Yexan running back with a red face. Lu Qin said with a smile, What's wrong? I'm telling you, even if you're happy to hear it, I won't say it again. Shoo shoo shoo. Yexan's face became even redder. She said angrily, Who wants to hear it again? I forgot to tell you something. Lu Qin said with a smile, What is it? Say it. Yexan's eyes seemed to be drifting. She didn't dare to look Lu Qin in the eye. She just glanced to the side and said, I went back to my home in Kunwa City yesterday and brought some pretty good tea. Do you want some? Yes, Lu Qin answered without hesitation. And Yexan seemed to be a bit happy and giggled. But soon after she seemed to remember something and said, Right, there's one more thing. Yesterday when I was about to leave the city, a fatty suddenly stopped me and asked me to tell you that the blue butterfly dew you ordered last time has arrived. He asked you to go down the mountain to get it when you have time. Lu Qin's expression suddenly turned cold. Chapter 130. Brother Lu, what is blue butterfly dew? Yexan looked at Lu Qin and asked in confusion, I've never heard of it before. Is it a rare mystical material? Lu Qin's pupils shrank slightly. After a moment, he took a deep breath and his expression returned to normal. He smiled and said, Oh, that's not a mystical material. It's just a kind of fine wine. It's not worth much. It's wine. Yexan shrugged. It was obvious that she had no interest in things like wine. She bid farewell to Lu Qin and turned to leave. However, at this moment Lu Qin called out to her. Yexan said, Brother Lu, is there anything else? Lu Qin was silent for a moment and said, Yexan, you have to be careful in your daily life. Don't trust others too easily. Yexan was a little surprised and said, Brother Lu, what do you mean? Is there something wrong with the person who asked me to pass on the message? That's not it. Lu Qin shook his head and seemed to smile bitterly. He then coughed and changed the topic, saying, There are too many bad people in this world. You're young and you look a little silly. I'm afraid you'll be taken advantage of. Hey, who's silly, who's silly? As expected, Yexan was immediately led astray by his words. She started to shout and huff. Lu Qin nodded with a smile and said, Anyway, that's roughly what I meant. Alright, he Changxing from before. Stay away from him if you don't have anything to do. If he really attacks me like a mad dog and injures you by accident, it'll be terrible. Yexan nodded and said, I know. Don't worry. She turned and left. Her footsteps were light and she seemed to be in a good mood. Lu Qin stood behind her, looking at her receding figure. He stood silently for a moment, turned around and suddenly scolded in a low voice, Damn fatty, what are you trying to do? At the foot of the Doghead Mountain, Atsu trotted all the way over. It had been many days since the earthquake. Many of the celestial birds and beasts that had fled here on that day had unknowingly returned, and once again occupied their orderly positions on the strange mountain top. When Atsu walked over, many animals saw him. The birds chirped, the ferocious beasts roared, and an ostrich accidentally kicked Atsu's butt as it passed by. There were even more exotic beasts who remembered how pathetic Atsu looked when he was thrown off the mountain peak. They all looked at Atsu with disdain and schadenfreude as he carefully walked up Doghead Mountain. The huge figure was still shrouding the top of the mountain. Rhinoceroses, fierce tigers, lions, giant elephants and red-crowned cranes danced in the air. There were even more exotic birds and beasts that Atsu had never seen or heard of before. It was unknown how so many of them had gathered in Kunlun Mountain. Among them there were quite a few ferocious beasts. When Atsu passed through their territory, they either provoked, obstructed, or intimidated him, causing Atsu to look back at every step, for fear that he would accidentally become food in the stomachs of others. With great difficulty, Atsu slowly climbed to the top of the Doghead Mountain. The journey was really exhausting. Atsu was so tired that he was half hanging out his tongue and panting. After resting for a while, he looked back and saw a huge oxen lying on the top of the mountain. Its eyes were half closed as if it was dozing off. Atu waited for a moment, and then he started to stride towards the green ox. At the same time, the entire mountain was deathly silent. The gazes of countless immortal beasts were looking towards the peak of the mountain, and they were waiting for the next shadow to be tossed down. Atsu wagged its tail and slowly walked to the side of Oxen, which was like a small mountain. It still seemed to be a little cautious, and in the silent atmosphere of the mountain, it seemed to be a little nervous. Woof! Atsu's bark was a little low, and there was some hesitation in it. It was more like a question. At this moment, a black figure suddenly swept across the sky. It was the thick and abnormally agile tail of Oxen. Immediately, all the beasts on the Doghead Mountain became excited. Lions and tigers raised their heads, and celestial birds spread their wings. All of them widened their eyes and stared at the top of the mountain. After a while, the tail gently fell and stroked the soft fur on the back of the black dog in front of Oxen. It patted it and then retracted it. Oxen opened and closed its eyes and then yawned. All the beasts on the mountain were dumbfounded. Atsu was stunned for a while, then suddenly jumped up and ran to the top of the mountain. It shook its body fiercely at all the beasts on the bottom of the Doghead Mountain, and then cried out in joy, "Woof woof woof woof! Woof woof!" Everyone on the top of the mountain was silent. Only the mountain breeze blew past, and the black dog stood on the top of the mountain, looking particularly awe-inspiring. At noon, Luchin found an excuse to go down the mountain and went to Kunwu City. Passing through the bustling long street, he seemed to turn a blind eye to the liveliness around him and went straight to the city wall. However, this day he didn't directly enter the city wall. Instead, he circled the street outside the alley twice and waited for another hour before he entered the alley and arrived at the Black Hill Pavilion that was completely deserted. The fat old Ma was lying on his beloved recliner drowsily. When he heard footsteps, he jumped up and said without opening his eyes, "Sir, look around. Our store has a lot of spiritual materials and the price is cheap. What's you?" Luchin looked at him and said with a sneer, "It's me. Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Old Ma let out a big yawn and sighed, "I thought there was finally business coming to my door." Luchin spat and said, "Dream on. Since this store opened, how many business deals have you made? Tell me." Old Ma coughed and said with a stern expression, "Let's not talk about the past. We have to look forward. Besides, what's wrong with dreaming? What if it succeeds?" Luchin stretched out a finger and gestured at him. Then his expression slightly darkened. He stared at Old Ma and said, "Tell me clearly, why did you suddenly drag that little girl EXN into this?" Old Ma shrugged and said, "I have something urgent to talk to you about, but you just don't go down the mountain recently. Isn't there no other way?" Luchin said without any trace of politeness, "Nonsense. You are so well informed and have so many connections. You can investigate whoever you want in the Kunlun party. There are at least dozens of spies in the mountain. Who did you call to tell me that I can't do it? Why did you have to drag an innocent girl into this?" Old Ma looked at Luchin and said with a smile, "What's wrong? I've never seen you so concerned about others." Luchin snorted and said, "Don't provoke me. We've been playing these things for a long time. I'm just telling you that EXIN has nothing to do with this matter. Don't drag her into this." Old Ma looked at him and said indifferently, "Is that what you mean?" Luchin seemed to have thought of something. He frowned and said nothing. Old Ma then smiled and said, "Those spies you mentioned are the same as you. If there is any danger, they will also put their lives in my hands. So, if I have to choose someone, of course I will protect my people. That girl from the E family was doomed from the day she met you. Why are you pretending to be stupid? Are you addicted to being Brother Lu in front of her? Do you really think you are a good person who can protect her for a lifetime?" Luchin suddenly raised his head and looked at Old Ma with cold eyes. However, Old Ma did not dodge. He just looked at him coldly. The atmosphere in the shop was icy cold. After some time, Luchin suddenly said, "You would never talk to me like this normally. What happened?" The fat on Old Ma's face trembled. It seemed as if he was suddenly annoyed. He said angrily, "Nonsense. I've always been this straightforward." Luchin did not look at him anymore. He turned to look around the shop and muttered, "There doesn't seem to be any assassins lying in ambush. Maybe they are hiding outside?" After pausing for a moment, he suddenly took a step in front of Old Ma and stretched out his hand to grab the fat on his face. Old Ma cried out and struggled free. "What are you doing?" he asked angrily. "I am checking to see if you have been forced to eat poison to harm me." "Bah, bah." Old Ma's spittle almost landed on Luchin's face. "Go to hell." You are the one who ate poison, the kind that rots your heart, lungs and intestines. Lu Chen clapped his hands and looked at old Ma with contempt. Remember to wash your face more next time. I can't stand a fat man with oily face. Old Ma kicked, but Lu Chen easily dodged it. Old Ma cursed and pointed to the back hall. Let's go there, he said grumpily. Why? He wants to see you. Lu Chen suddenly fell silent and looked at old Ma. The anger on old Ma's face disappeared at that moment. He looked at Lu Chen with concern. After a while he sighed and said, Go. Lu Chen nodded and walked towards the courtyard at the back of the hall. After taking 2 steps, old Ma suddenly said, Oh right, you should tell that missy yourself when you get back. Lu Chen stopped and did not look back. What is it? Old Ma said indifferently, The girl is young and naive. She trusts others too easily. I only said a few words and she believed me. She didn't even think to ask me how I knew about your relationship with her. Lu Chen was silent. After a while he slowly shook his head. He did not say anything and walked to the back hall. After passing through the long and narrow alley, he saw the familiar square courtyard. However, unlike before, this time, Lu Chen saw the figure of that person at first glance. When that abnormally fat and broad figure sat in the small courtyard, it even gave off the illusion that the courtyard was almost filled to the brim. His loose robe, sitting cross-legged, and shiny bald head all spoke of this person's identity. A bird flew over the courtyard by chance. It seemed to be tired or curious. It slowly fluttered its wings and landed on his bald head. It did not seem to feel any hostility, but it also seemed to feel that it was only a stone under its feet. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked ahead and smiled. He waved at Lu Chen and said gently, You're here. Come and sit. Chapter 131. Lu Chen took a few steps forward and sat down on the stone steps in the small yard. He was a little far from Perfected Lord Tianlan, but they could still see each other clearly. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him without any anger on his face. His eyes were gentle and there was even a hint of a smile on his lips, as if he was looking at a stubborn and naughty child. How have you been? He asked Lu Chen with a smile. Lu Chen said, Not bad. Is there any progress on that matter? Lu Chen glanced at him and said lightly, Old Ma knows all these things and he must have told you clearly. Why do you still ask me? Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, He is not you after all. There might be some differences when he conveys the message in the middle. Besides, I still want to hear you say it again. Lu Chen frowned and said after a moment of silence, I still don't have any clues. I didn't find any traces of the devil cult's activities on Kunlun Mountain either. I can only slowly investigate it now. I randomly set a few targets and asked Old Ma to investigate them first and see what the results are. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded with an indifferent expression and said, I got it. But I'm a little curious about the 2 people you want to investigate. Why did you choose these 2 girls instead of others? Lu Chen said expressionlessly, There's no reason. I just met them a few times and it was convenient. Convenient. Even though Perfected Lord Tianlan was experienced and knowledgeable, he couldn't help but smile bitterly at this moment and said, It seems that those 2 girls are a little unlucky to know you. Lu Chen looked up slightly and said, If they are the spies of the devil cult, then they are really unlucky. All right. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and waved his hand. Anyway, you just do it. I believe in you. Lu Chen smiled, then glanced at him and said, Why do you have the time to visit me today? I remember that you have been staying in Zhangxianming for a while, right? Perfected Lord Tianlan said, I've been back for a while now and I've always wanted to meet you. However, it's really inconvenient on Kunlun. Now that you're at the foot of the mountain, it's rare for you to come down. That's why it's been delayed until today. He smiled and said, Actually, if you don't come today, I'll be leaving tomorrow. Lu Chen was startled for a moment, then said, No wonder Old Ma was so anxious. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled without saying anything. Lu Chen frowned and suddenly said, You've been back for a while and you came back secretly without anyone in the sect knowing? His eyes suddenly brightened and sharpened as he looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Did something happen in the sect? Something came up. What is it? It's not convenient for me to tell you. Lu Chen's eyes flashed and he looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Oh, you can't even tell me? Perfected Lord Tianlan thought for a while and then shook his head. It's still hard to say. However, I might be able to tell you when you're done with this and I take you in as a disciple. Lu Qin looked at perfected Lord Tianlan and the light in his eyes grew brighter. He suddenly stood up and said, "Seems like it's a big matter?" "Yes, it's a big matter. And it's a big secret of the Kunlun party." "I think so." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "Why? Are you very curious and want to know?" "Yes." Lu Qin answered crisply, "What secret is there in the Kunlun party that the fiend cult coveted it so much that they even bet the fate of the entire sect on it? There must be something behind it. It might be helpful in finding the fiend cult spy. I want to know." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment as though he was weighing the pros and cons in his heart. Then he smiled apologetically and said, "I'm sorry, I still can't tell you. However, I can tell you that only senior brother Bai Chen and I participated in that matter. I believe it has nothing to do with the fiend cult spy that you mentioned." Lu Chen's expression changed slightly. After a while, he shook his head slowly and said, "You two perfected lords are highly respected. It's naturally impossible for you to collude with the fiend cult." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled without saying anything. He looked at Lu Qin and a dark light flickered in the depths of his eyes like gentle waves on the ocean. The bird chirped and didn't fly away even after a long time. It seemed to be reluctant to part with perfected Lord Tianlan's huge bald head. It looked around and occasionally pecked at the shiny skull with its beak. However, perfected Lord Tianlan looked calm as though he did not care about the bird at all and did not feel the pain at all. "Is there anything I can help with?" Perfected Lord Tianlan asked Lu Qin. Lu Qin asked, "You want to help me? Shouldn't I? I was the one who asked you to do this. If there's anything I can help with, I can also do something in passing. There are a few people. Help me kill them," Lu Qin said. Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "That's not very good, right?" After thinking for a while, he said, "Are you sure that those people are suspected to be fiend cult spies?" "No, I just don't like them," Lu Qin said and then added, "Just like you." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled bitterly and sighed. "I shouldn't have told you the truth back then," Lu Qin sneered. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with gentle eyes that still seemed to be doting. However, after a while, he suddenly said, "Little Lu, I realize that you're a little different from before." Lu Qin said, "What? You don't seem to be afraid of me anymore." Lu Qin sneered and said sarcastically, "Look at what you're saying as if I've been afraid of you for so many years. Didn't I say the same thing to you a few years ago?" Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head with a playful look in his eyes. He looked at Lu Qin and said, "That's not it. Back then, even though you were always joking around in front of me, you still had some respect for me. Come on, why would I be afraid of you? You're not afraid of me. You respected the word, perfected Lord, deep in your heart. At that time I could tell that you, like almost all the cultivators in the world, had an instinctive fear and admiration for the supreme position of perfected Lord, this realm, and the strength that this title represents." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled, but his eyes were unusually bright as he looked at Lu Qin. It was as if he could see through his body and see through his organs. That's the supreme realm that billions of cultivators can never reach in their entire lives. For thousands of years, everyone respected it. Everyone is the same. I can tell. Ha. Lu Qin laughed, but there seemed to be a slight change in his expression. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him and said slowly, "But when we met in the barren valley previously, I felt that something was wrong. However, I couldn't figure it out no matter how I thought about it." His eyes flickered slightly and he said gently, "It was only when I looked at you just now that I suddenly understood what was wrong." The smile on Lu Chen's face suddenly disappeared as he looked at the fat man coldly. Perfected Lord Tianlan pointed at Lu Chen and said calmly, "You're not afraid of me anymore. To be exact, you, an ordinary cultivator with such a low cultivation base, actually no longer have that instinctive reverence for the strength of a soul formation perfected Lord." Lu Chen said coldly, "I don't understand what you've been talking about." Perfected Lord Tianlan narrowed his eyes and stared at Lu Chen as if he was re-examining him. After a while he suddenly said, "God subduing mantra, right?" Lu Chen's face suddenly turned pale. When Atsu ran out of the forest it looked at the sky. Although it was still bright, the sun was already setting in the west. It should be evening soon. Today on the Doghead Mountain it was very happy and excited. It finally blended in with those immortal birds and strange beasts that usually had their eyes on the top of their heads. It made it feel proud and elated. Even its footsteps when it ran back seemed to be lighter than usual. It was a pity that dogs couldn't hum, otherwise Atsu would definitely be whistling all the way back. From afar it saw Lu Chen's house and Atsu ran all the way there. However, when it was about 100 feet away Atsu suddenly stopped. It saw a figure walking back and forth outside the house. It was a man with a strange expression on his face. His face was a little red and his eyes were a little unfocused. His chest was heaving up and down as if he was gasping for breath. There was also a hand that was hidden in his chest as if he was grabbing something. That person kept looking around, but more often than not, he was staring at Lu Chen's house. He was mumbling something, but it was unclear what he was saying. He just kept pacing around the house. Atsu was a little puzzled and stared at that person for a while. But apart from his suspicious behavior, that person didn't seem to be doing anything else. Atsu waited for a while and saw that the sky seemed to be a little darker. After thinking for a while, it felt that it should go back first. So it ran towards the house. When it ran past that person, it could see that the man glanced at it, but he didn't seem to care, nor did he do anything else. Atsu was a little relieved. It ran to the door and called twice, but the house was quiet. No one answered. Behind it, the man suddenly stopped and turned around to look at it. Atsu didn't pay attention to the movement behind it. Unfortunately, it found that there was no one at home. But now, this kind of thing was no longer a problem for it. Wagging its tail, Atsu ran to the back of the house. The small dog hole there was now its exclusive passage. But at this moment, suddenly, there was a call from behind it. "Little dog." Atsu's footsteps paused for a moment. It stopped in front of the dog hole and looked back. It saw that it was the strange man from before. He didn't know when he had walked over, but he was standing not far behind it. There was a strange smile on his face and he smiled at it. His teeth were very white. Deathly white. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.